In Midland Correctional Facility, a black inmate was about to shatter the carefully maintained order of a prison ruled by fear. What started as a routine cell inspection spiraled when Sergeant Ray Danning, a white guard with a reputation for unchecked brutality, made an example of a young inmate who dared to look him in the eye. Jamal Rook Evans wasn't your typical prisoner. A former law student wrongfully convicted in a botched case, he had spent 7 years inside Midland, quietly enduring, observing, and waiting. Among inmates, he was known for his sharp mind and strategic patience. The kind of man who didn't waste moves, only made the ones that mattered. When Danning orchestrated a brutal takedown of DeShawn D-Blade Carter, fabricating charges and sending him to solitary, he had no idea he was messing with a man who played a longer, smarter game. Rook didn't rage or retaliate. He set something in motion, an unspoken shift in the prison's power balance that would make Midland's walls shake. What began as abuse of power would become a reckoning. The inmates, the guards, the entire prison system itself. None of them would forget the day Sergeant Danning finally faced the consequences of the years he spent ruling with impunity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The concrete corridors of Midland Correctional Facility remained, cold even in the summer heat that baked the surrounding countryside. Here in this forgotten corner of the Deep South, time moved differently, measured not in hours or days, but in the slow erosion of humanity. Sergeant Ray Danning liked it that way. Control was a living, breathing thing to him. It required constant attention. 23 years in this place had taught him that lesson well. "Something on your mind, Washington?" Danning's voice carried the particular cadence of the rural South, deceptively gentle, like honey hiding poison. The young inmate, barely 22, stiffened but kept his eyes trained on the floor. "No, sir." "No? Because I could swear I saw you roll your eyes when I gave that order." Danning circled closer, his boots clicking against the concrete, the sound echoing through the now silent cell block. The other guards had gone mysteriously quiet, a trained response when Danning began one of his corrections. "I didn't roll my eyes, sir." Washington's voice remained level, though a slight tremor betrayed his fear. Danning nodded thoughtfully, hands resting on his belt near his baton. "See, that's the problem with you boys. You lie even when the truth might save you." He leaned in, close enough that only Washington could hear his next words. "Pride's a luxury you can't afford in here." From the shadowed corner of the second tier, Jamal Rook Evans watched the familiar scene unfold. His gaze was steady, analytical, eyes that had seen this ritual play out dozens of times during his 7 years. Inside, unlike many who'd learned to look away, Rook made himself watch. Every detail mattered. "O'Shea," Danning called out, not bothering to look over his shoulder. "I believe inmate Washington's cell needs a thorough inspection." Mark O'Shea stepped forward from his position near the guard station. Younger than Danning by almost 20 years, his face still retained traces of the idealism that had led him to this career. Those traces were fading quickly. "Yes, Sergeant," he replied, reaching for his keys. Washington's eyes widened. "My cell was just searched yesterday." Danning's smile never reached his eyes. "Was it? Well, seems like we missed something because someone's been passing contraband through this block." He gripped Washington's arm, fingers digging into flesh. "Unless you'd like to tell me who's been doing that." "I don't know anything about—" The blow came without warning, Danning's baton connecting with Washington's kidneys. The young man crumpled, gasping. No one moved to help. No one dared. "That's one," Danning stated calmly, as if marking a tally. "I can keep going all day." O'Shea's gaze flickered between the fallen inmate and Danning, a momentary hesitation crossing his features before he quickly masked it. He moved toward Washington's cell, keys jangling. 3 tiers up, DeShawn D-Blade Carter gripped the railing, knuckles white. "I swear to God I'm going to cut that pig's throat one of these days," he muttered. Rook, standing beside him, placed a steadying hand on D-Blade's tense forearm. "That's exactly what he wants," he whispered. "Reaction. Excuse." You know how this ends. D-Blade's massive frame tensed. At 6'4" and built like he was carved from stone, he could snap most men in half. But Rook's words reached him, as they always did. Man's been pushing like this for years. Someone's got to push back. We will, Rook replied, his voice barely audible over Washington's stifled groans below. But not with our fists. D-Blade's laugh was bitter. What then? Write a complaint? Call the ACLU? Man, we're already buried, ain't nobody coming to save us. Rook's eyes never left Danning, who now stood watching as O'Shea systematically destroyed Washington's meager possessions. That's right, he agreed, nobody's coming to save us. 2 hours later, after count and lockdown, Rook sat on his bunk, a single sheet of paper carefully unfolded between his fingers. The cell was dark except for the sickly yellow security light that filtered through the small window in the door. This better be worth it, D-Blade said from the neighboring cell. Slim took a big risk getting that to you. Rook didn't answer immediately. The document was official, a prison incident report with the state seal watermarked on the letterhead. Most of it was redacted with thick black marker, but the crucial details remained visible. Inmate Marcus Johnson, found deceased in solitary confinement, cause of death listed as suicide by hanging. But the coroner's notes, partially visible, despite the redaction, told a different story. Multiple contusions inconsistent with hanging. Evidence of restraint, tracheal damage indicating. And there, at the bottom, the authorizing signature. Sergeant Raymond Danning. Well? D-Blade pressed. What we got? Rook carefully refolded the paper, sliding it into a small gap he'd created in the binding of his law textbook. We've got his leash, he finally replied. Johnson didn't kill himself 3 years ago. Shit, we all knew that, D-Blade scoffed. But knowing and proving are different things. This puts Danning in that cell the night Johnson died. This has the real cause of death. This is more than rumor, it's documentation. D-Blade fell silent for a moment. So what's the play? We send that to the warden? The newspaper? Rook shook his head in the darkness. Warden Holloway would bury it again. And the media? They'd run a story that everyone would forget in a week. He leaned against the cold concrete wall. No, we need to be smarter than that. This is just the beginning. Of what? Of dismantling the entire system that protects him, Rook answered, his voice taking on an edge rarely heard from the typically composed man. Danning's not just a rogue guard. He's a symptom of what this place is built on, D-Blade snorted. Man, you still think like a lawyer. I am a lawyer, Rook corrected. Just because they took my freedom doesn't mean they took my mind. The following morning, as inmates filed into the cafeteria, the usual segregated seating arrangement maintained itself without need for enforcement. Years of racial tension and prison politics had established invisible boundaries that few dared to cross. Rook moved through the line with practiced calm. His tray held steady as a ladle. Of colorless oatmeal was slapped onto it. As he reached for a cup of watered-down coffee, his eyes met Danning's from across the room. The guard was watching him with unusual intensity. You got a problem I should know about, Evans? Danning asked, moving closer. No problem, Sergeant, Rook replied evenly. Funny, because I get the feeling you've been paying extra attention to me lately. Danning's voice dropped. I don't like being watched. Rook's face betrayed nothing. Just trying to stay out of trouble, sir. See that you do. Danning held his gaze a moment longer before turning away. But as he walked back toward his post, he called over his shoulder, I've got my eye on you, counselor, don't forget that. O'Shea, stationed near the serving line, had witnessed the exchange. When Danning was out of earshot, he muttered to Rook, Don't poke the bear. He's been in a mood all week. Rook nodded slightly, moving past. Appreciate the concern, Officer O'Shea. The young guard looked uncomfortable. It's not concern, just keeping the peace. Rook allowed himself the smallest of smiles as he walked to his table. O'Shea was different, still soft where this Place tried to make men hard. That could be useful. At the table, D-Blade was already waiting with Marcus Slim Benson, a rail-thin man whose nervous energy was as much a part of him as his perpetually darting eyes. "He suspects something," Slim whispered, glancing at Danning. "He's been asking questions about who's moving what." "Let him ask," Rook replied calmly, stirring his oatmeal. "Right now, paranoia works in our favor." D-Blade leaned in. "So, what's the first move?" Rook's gaze swept the cafeteria, over the clusters of inmates segregated by race and affiliation, over the guards stationed at strategic points, over Danning, who continued to watch him with suspicion. This was the chessboard, and every piece had its purpose. "We wait," he said finally. "We make him feel it before he sees it, like smoke before fire." D-Blade shook his head in frustration. "Always the long game with you." "In here," Rook replied, "the long game is the only one worth playing." Across the room, Danning's radio crackled with static. He answered it, then cast one final glance at Rook before exiting the cafeteria. Rook watched him go, the document's contents heavy in his thoughts. The game had already begun, but Danning didn't know it yet. And in this game, the king wouldn't see the checkmate coming until it was too late. The library cart squeaked as it rolled, across the worn linoleum floor of the administrative wing. Behind it, inmate Carlos Mendez kept his eyes down, focusing on the rhythm of the wheels rather than the curious glances of the secretaries. As one of the few trusted minimum security inmates with work privileges in this area, he had learned invisibility was his greatest asset. No one questioned the library cart. No one questioned Carlos. "Morning," he murmured, pausing at the door to Warden Holloway's outer office. The secretary, Ms. Winters, barely looked up from her computer screen. "Just leave the books on the side table, Carlos. The warden's out until this afternoon." Carlos nodded, pulling a small stack of legal volumes from the cart. He requested, "These specifically, constitutional law and precedent." He set them down carefully, ensuring the small manila envelope slipped between two of the thicker books remained just barely visible. Not hidden. That would arouse suspicion if found, but unobtrusive enough that Ms. Winters wouldn't notice until Carlos was long gone. "Can you sign for them?" he asked, extending the clipboard. As she scribbled her signature, Carlos glanced at the closed door to the warden's inner office. Rook's instructions had been precise, timed to coincide with Holloway's weekly meeting at the state capitol. "All set," Ms. Winters said, handing back the clipboard. Carlos nodded, already backing away with the cart. "Have a good day, ma'am." 3 hours later, in the laundry facility deep within the prison's industrial wing, Rook sorted sheets with mechanical precision. The humid air hung heavy, thick with the scent of industrial detergent and sweat. It was one of the few work assignments where different racial groups mixed with minimal friction. Nobody wanted laundry duty, but it offered unique privacy amid the noise of the machines. "It's done," Carlos confirmed, his voice barely audible over the rumble of industrial dryers. "Exactly like you said, between the books, visible enough to be found." Rook nodded, never breaking rhythm in his folding. "Good. You're clean." "No. Connection to me, right?" "I'm just the library guy," Carlos replied with a shrug. "Nobody even looks at me twice." "Keep it that way," Rook advised. "When this starts moving, you stay clear." At the far end of the laundry room, DeShawn monitored the conversation from his position, feeding sheets into the massive washing machines. His size and reputation ensured no one approached their corner without good reason. "You really think Holloway's going to care about some dead inmate from 3 years ago?" DeShawn asked when Carlos had gone. "Man got his political aspirations. One less black man in the world don't mean shit to him." Rook's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "It's not about making him care about Johnson. It's about making him care about himself." He lowered his voice further. "Holloway's looking at a run for state office next year. Last thing he needs is a scandal about prisoner abuse and cover-ups attached to his record. So he throws Danning under the bus to save his own ass? That's the idea." Rook stacked another pile of folded sheets. But first we see how they both react. Holloway might try to bury it deeper. Danning will start looking for who's targeting him. DeShawn snorted. And we just wait? We watch, Rook corrected, and we prepare for the next move. In the officer's mess, Sergeant Ray Danning stabbed at his meatloaf with unusual aggression, barely tasting the food as he shoveled it into his mouth. 2 tables away, rookie guards gave him a wide berth, sensing his dark mood. Only Mark O'Shea dared to approach, sliding onto the bench across from him with a tray of food. "You look like hell," O'Shea observed, opening his carton of milk. Danning grunted. "Got a situation brewing. I can feel it." "What kind of situation?" Danning's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room, making sure no one was within earshot. "My usual sources have gone quiet. 3 separate informants all suddenly claiming they got nothing to report." He stabbed another chunk of meatloaf. "That doesn't happen by accident." O'Shea took a bite of his sandwich, considering. "Could be nothing. Things have been pretty calm lately." "Calm is what worries me," Danning replied, lowering his voice. "These animals don't do calm unless they're planning something." His fork scraped against the plastic tray. "Especially that lawyer, Evans. You seen the way he watches me?" O'Shea shifted uncomfortably. "Rook? He keeps to himself, far as I've seen. One of the few who's never caused trouble." "That's what makes him dangerous," Danning hissed. "He's smart, patient, not like the rest of these thugs." He leaned forward. "I want you to keep an eye on him. Report anything unusual. Who he talks to, what books he reads, every damn thing." The younger guard frowned slightly. "You got something specific you're looking for?" "I'll know it when I see it." Danning's tone ended the discussion. As they ate in silence, O'Shea studied his mentor surreptitiously. In the 3 years he'd worked under Danning, he'd never seen the sergeant this tense. The man had always projected absolute control, feared by inmates and respected by guards for his ability to maintain order in the toughest blocks. But now, something had changed. There was a brittleness to Danning's confidence that hadn't been there before, a hypervigilance that went beyond his usual caution. "By the way," O'Shea ventured after several minutes, "you hear anything about Washington's complaint?" Danning scoffed. "What complaint?" "The one about the cell search last week. He filed it with the prison ombudsman, claims excessive force." A flash of anger crossed Danning's face. "Let him file. His word against mine." He pushed his tray away, half the food untouched. "Ombudsman knows which side his bread is buttered on." O'Shea nodded, but a small knot formed in his stomach. 3 months ago, Danning would have laughed off such a complaint. Now the sergeant seemed irritated by even the mention of it. As Danning stood to leave, he paused, hand gripping O'Shea's shoulder with unexpected force. "Remember who your friends are in this place, Mark. When the shit hits, you want to be on the right side." Marcus "Slim" Benson had built his entire prison existence around survival. At 5'9" and barely 150 pounds, he'd learned early that in Midland, information was better protection than muscle. For years, he'd played all sides, providing enough intelligence to the guards to keep himself safe, while giving inmates just enough to avoid being labeled a complete snitch. It was a dangerous balance, but one he'd maintained successfully. Until now. As he mopped the hallway outside the commissary, his eyes kept darting to the clock. Danning expected his weekly report, but for the first time, Slim had nothing concrete to share. Rook had made sure of that, compartmentalizing his plan so tightly that even Slim, who prided himself on knowing everything, could only catch glimpses. "You looking a little nervous there, Slim?" The voice froze him in place. Ethan Price leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. The leader of Midland's Aryan Brotherhood faction wore his hatred like a badge of honor, white supremacist, tattoos crawling up his neck and across his shaved scalp. Slim forced a smile. "Just trying to finish before shift change, Price, no trouble." Price's pale eyes narrowed. "Hear you been awful quiet lately. Not your usual chatty self." He pushed off the wall, moving closer. "Danning's boy not earning his keep anymore?" "Don't know what you're talking about," Slim muttered, clutching the mop handle tighter. "Sure you do." Price circled him slowly. See, my boys notice things, like how you ain't been whispering in Danning's ear this past week. His smile was cold. Makes a man wonder if you found a new friend. Slim's heart hammered against his ribs. I mind my business. You should do the same. Price laughed, the sound echoing off the empty corridor. Danning's getting jumpy, asking questions, throwing his weight around where it ain't wanted. He leaned in close enough that Slim could smell the cigarettes on his breath. Tell your boss the race soldiers are getting tired of his shit. He starts cracking down on my business. We got a problem. I'll pass that along, Slim replied cautiously. Price nodded, satisfied. You do that. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Slim, I hear you've been spending time with Rook and his crew lately. His eyes hardened. Dangerous game you're playing. After Price disappeared around the corner, Slim leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. He'd survived this long by knowing exactly where he stood with everyone in the prison ecosystem. But suddenly the ground beneath his feet felt unstable. He needed to give Danning something. Anything. In the prison yard that afternoon, the usual segregation was in full effect. The basketball courts dominated by black inmates. The bench area claimed by Price's white supremacist crew. The tables near the fence controlled by the Latino gangs. Guards patrolled the perimeter, maintaining the illusion of control over a system that largely regulated itself. Rook sat at one of the concrete tables, a dog-eared paperback open before him, though his attention was elsewhere. DeShawn stood nearby, engaged in a seemingly casual conversation with two other inmates while keeping watch. We got movement, DeShawn murmured as he leaned over, pretending to comment on Rook's book. Slim's talking to Danning by the east gate, looking real nervous. Rook didn't look up. Expected. He needs to feed something to stay valuable. You trust that skinny rat? Trust isn't relevant, Rook replied. I only told him what I wanted Danning to know. Across the yard, Danning listened intently as Slim spoke, his face growing darker by the moment. The sergeant's hand rested on his baton, fingers clenching and unclenching reflexively. I think Slim's selling you out, DeShawn observed. He's selling everyone out, Rook corrected. That's his nature. Right now he's telling Danning that something big is brewing, but he doesn't know what. He turned a page in his book. He's also telling him that Price is getting restless. DeShawn's eyebrows rose. You fed him that? A small smile touched Rook's lips. Price and Danning have had an arrangement for years. Price's people get extra privileges, and in return, they help keep other groups in line. But if Danning starts to look weak, Price won't back a losing horse, DeShawn finished. Damn, Rook. You're playing them against each other. I'm not playing anyone, Rook said calmly. I'm just accelerating existing tensions. On the far side of the yard, Danning dismissed Slim with a curt nod, then turned his attention toward the weight benches. Price met his gaze across the distance, the white supremacist's expression deliberately neutral before he turned back to his workout, pointedly ignoring the sergeant. The slight was small, but noticeable, and in prison, such small gestures carried weight. Danning's jaw tightened as he keyed his radio, summoning two more guards to the yard. O'Shea appeared moments later, jogging from the main building. What's the situation? O'Shea asked, scanning the yard for signs of trouble. I want a full contraband sweep of the AB's cells, Danning ordered. Now, while they're out here. O'Shea blinked in surprise. The Aryan Brotherhood? But they're— Did I stutter? Danning snapped. Get a team together. I want every inch of their territory torn apart. Yes, sir, O'Shea replied, confusion evident in his voice. The white supremacist group had long been Danning's go-to for maintaining order among the racial factions. Targeting them was unprecedented. As O'Shea departed, Danning's gaze shifted, settling on Rook. The inmate appeared absorbed in his reading, seemingly oblivious to the sergeant's scrutiny. But Danning knew better. Something was shifting in his carefully controlled domain. The typical channels of information had gone quiet. Alliances were beginning to fray, and at the center of it all, somehow, was Jamal Evans. "What are you up to, counselor?" he muttered under his breath. Warden Ernest Holloway considered himself, above all things, a practical man. 27 years in corrections had taught him that idealism was the first casualty of the job. What remained was pragmatism, the delicate art of keeping the facility running, the budget balanced, and most importantly, his career intact. The manila envelope on his desk threatened all three. He studied the partially redacted incident report with growing unease. The death of Marcus Johnson had been settled years ago, ruled a suicide, paperwork filed, case closed. The family had even been paid a small settlement to forestall any lawsuit. Yet here was this ghost, resurfacing at the most inconvenient time. Holloway buzzed his secretary. "Get Sergeant Danning in here, immediately." While he waited, the warden poured himself a finger of bourbon from the bottle he kept in his bottom drawer. Campaign season was approaching, and his transition from prison administration to state politics required a spotless record. A scandal involving inmate deaths and cover-ups would destroy everything he'd built. His intercom buzzed. "Sergeant Danning is here, sir. Send him in." Danning entered, his uniform crisp as always, but Holloway noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the vigilant set of his eyes. "You wanted to see me, Warden?" Holloway motioned to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat, Ray." Danning remained standing. "I prefer to stand if it's all the same to you." "Suit yourself." Holloway took a measured sip of bourbon, letting the silence stretch. Control of the conversation was essential. "I received something interesting today. Anonymous delivery." He pushed the envelope across the desk. "Take a look." Danning picked it up warily, his expression hardening as he examined its contents. "Where did this come from?" "I just told you it was anonymous." Holloway leaned back in his chair. "The more relevant question is why it's surfacing now, 3 years after the fact." "Someone's trying to cause trouble," Danning replied, dropping the envelope back on the desk with forced casualness. Johnson hanged himself. "The official report is clear." "The official report, yes." Holloway tapped his finger against the redacted document. "But this suggests otherwise, and it has your signature authorizing the final cell check before his death." He fixed Danning with a level stare. "Tell me there's nothing to this, Ray." Danning's face betrayed nothing. Johnson was a troublemaker. Chronic discipline cases like him often take the easy way out. "That doesn't answer my question." "There's nothing to it," Danning stated flatly. "Johnson killed himself. End of story." Holloway studied him for a long moment. They'd worked together for over a decade, maintaining a delicate balance of mutual convenience. Danning kept the prison under control, often through methods that wouldn't bear close scrutiny, while Holloway provided political protection and turned a blind eye when necessary. It had been a profitable arrangement for both of them. "I'm concerned about the timing," Holloway said finally. "This facility has maintained an exemplary record under my administration. No major incidents, no escapes, minimal violence." He picked up the document again. "I can't have that compromised, particularly not now." Danning nodded stiffly. "I understand. Do you?" Holloway's voice hardened. "Because something is happening in my prison. I'm hearing rumors of unrest, unusual patterns, disruptions to the normal order." He leaned forward. "And now this surfaces? It suggests a coordinated effort." "I'm handling it," Danning insisted. "See that you do." Holloway rose from his chair, signaling the end of the meeting. "Whatever fire is smoldering, put it out, quickly and quietly." His tone left no room for argument. "If this escalates, if I receive so much as a whisper of this reaching outside these walls, I will not hesitate to distance myself from the situation, completely." The threat hung in the air between them, explicit in its clarity. "Understood, Warden." Danning turned to leave. "One more thing," Holloway called after him. "Find out who sent this. I want to know who's trying to destabilize my prison." After Danning departed, Holloway returned to his desk, eyeing the bourbon bottle before deciding against another drink. The incident with Johnson had been messy, one of several necessary evils in maintaining order at Midland. But he'd ensured the official record was clean, the proper narratives established. If someone was digging into the past, they'd need to be stopped. Definitively. He picked up his phone, dialing a private number. "It's Holloway. We may have a situation developing." He paused, listening to the response. "No, not yet. But be prepared to implement containment protocols if necessary." As he hung up, Holloway gazed out the window at the prison yard below. From this height, the inmates looked like pieces on a chessboard, their movements dictated by rules and boundaries they couldn't escape. He had always been good at chess. Sergeant Ray Danning slammed his locker shut, the metal door buckling, slightly under the force. The officer's changing room was empty this late in the shift, which suited him fine. He needed space to think, to plan his next move. The meeting with Warden Holloway replayed in his mind. 23 years of service, of keeping this hellhole under control, and Holloway had threatened to cut him loose without hesitation, like he was disposable, like he hadn't been the one doing the warden's dirty work all these years. Danning caught his reflection in the small mirror hanging inside his locker door. The face that stared back seemed older somehow, the lines deeper, the eyes harder. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his flask, taking a long pull of whiskey. "You okay, Ray?" Danning turned to find Captain Harris watching him from the doorway, concern etched across his weathered face. "Fine," Danning muttered, quickly, pocketing the flask. "Just tired." Harris nodded, unconvinced. "Heard you had a meeting with Holloway. Everything square?" "Nothing I can't handle." Danning grabbed his keys, eager to end the conversation. "Good to hear." Harris blocked the exit, his voice dropping. "Because the men are talking. They're saying you've been on edge lately." Danning's eyes narrowed. "The men should worry about doing their jobs. That's just it." Harris held his gaze. "We've always followed your lead, Ray. Backed your plays even when things got creative. But lately you're making moves that don't make sense." He paused. "Like ordering a sweep of Price's crew. You've had an understanding with the AB for years. Maybe I don't like how Price has been flexing lately," Danning countered. "Getting too comfortable." Harris shook his head. "This place runs on balance. You start shaking that up without warning us. People get nervous." "You questioning me, Harris?" "Just looking out for a friend." Harris stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. "Whatever's going on, handle it clean. We've all got too much history to risk now." Danning pushed past him without responding, his mind racing. First Holloway, now Harris. The foundation he'd built was showing cracks, and he needed to seal them quickly. One thought burned through: the alcohol haze. Find whoever was responsible, and make an example so severe that no one would dare challenge him again. Mark O'Shea found Rook shelving books in the prison library, a task that afforded the inmate certain privileges due to his education and good behavior. The library was nearly empty this late in the day, with only a handful of inmates scattered among the tables. "Need a word, Evans," O'Shea said, keeping his voice professional. Rook glanced up from his cart. "Of course, Officer O'Shea." They moved to a quiet corner between two tall shelves of outdated legal texts. O'Shea checked twice to ensure they weren't overheard. "Danning's conducting a sweep of your cell tonight," he said without preamble. "Whatever you've got that you shouldn't, get rid of it now." Rook's expression remained neutral. "Appreciate the heads up, though I don't have anything to hide." "Sure you don't." O'Shea leaned closer. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but Danning's on the warpath. I've never seen him like this. He's convinced you're behind whatever's happening." "And what exactly is happening, officer?" O'Shea hesitated. "Information's drying up, alliances shifting. And now there's some paperwork from years back that's got both Danning and the warden spooked." He studied Rook carefully. "You know anything about that?" "I'm just trying to serve my time," Rook replied evenly. "Right." O'Shea's voice hardened. "Well, whatever you're not doing, it's working. Danning's losing it, and when he crashes, he's going to take people down with him. People like me who've worked with him. Rook set down the book he'd been holding. Is that what worries you? Being collateral damage? Wouldn't it worry you? I'd be more worried about being complicit, Rook said quietly. About standing by while someone abuses power. About what that makes me. O'Shea's face flushed. You don't know what it's like. This job. You make compromises. We all make choices, Rook corrected, and we all face consequences for them, even those who think they're just following orders. The guard's eyes narrowed. You threatening me? No. Rook's voice softened. I'm giving you the same courtesy you just gave me. A warning. When systems of abuse collapse, they rarely distinguish between architects and bystanders. O'Shea stared at him for a long moment. You really think you can change anything in here? I think, Rook replied carefully, that even in Midland, actions eventually have consequences. O'Shea checked his watch. You've got about 2 hours before the sweep. I'd use that time wisely. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I never liked how Danning handled Johnson's case. Rook watched him go, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his features. O'Shea's conscience might prove to be the lever that finally shifted the balance of power. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the prison kitchen, DeShawn wielded a massive ladle, stirring a vat of what passed for stew with mechanical precision. His position on kitchen duty allowed him to move between different sections of the prison with relative freedom, a tactical advantage Rook had carefully cultivated over months. We got problems, DeShawn muttered as Rook approached, ostensibly to discuss the evening meal service. Slim's been talking again. To Danning? DeShawn nodded. Saw them in the corridor outside the infirmary, Slim looking scared, Danning looking ready to explode. Expected, Rook replied. Slim's survival instinct is kicking in. He senses the shift and wants to be on the winning side. There won't be sides if Danning decides to make an example of you, DeShawn countered. Word is he's planning something. A sweep at minimum. O'Shea already warned me. DeShawn's eyebrows shot up. The young guard? He's flipping too? Not flipping, Rook corrected. Just hedging his bets. His conscience is getting to him. Conscience won't mean shit if Danning plants something in your cell. DeShawn lowered his voice further. Let me handle this my way. One night, one shank, problem solved. Rook's expression hardened. That's exactly what we're not doing. Why the hell not? You think Danning would hesitate to put you in the ground? Because it's not about Danning, Rook replied firmly. It's about the system that created him, that protects him. Kill Danning, and another one just like him takes his place. DeShawn shook his head in frustration. All I'm saying is your chess game's getting dangerous. We need to be ready to move direct if it comes to that. It won't, Rook assured him. Trust the plan. As they spoke, the kitchen door swung open. Ethan Price entered with 2 of his crew, his path taking him directly toward the serving line where Rook and DeShawn stood. The tension in the room spiked immediately. Several Blackwater inmates at nearby prep stations straightened, hands drifting toward kitchen implements that could serve as weapons. Ain't meal service yet, Price, DeShawn said coldly. Price smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Just checking on tonight's menu, making sure my boys are getting proper nutrition. Same slop as everyone else, DeShawn replied. Price's gaze shifted to Rook. Hear Danning's taking a special interest in you, counselor. Nothing I can't handle, Rook replied calmly. Maybe. Price leaned against the counter. But things are changing around here. Danning's getting sloppy. Unpredictable. His voice dropped. Had my boy's cells tossed yesterday. Found some things he shouldn't have. Rook kept his expression neutral. Sounds like a personal problem. It is now. Price's smile vanished. See, Danning and I had an understanding. My people get certain considerations, and in return we maintain order. But he's breaking that. Understanding, showing weakness. And you don't tolerate weakness, Rook stated. In here? Price laughed harshly. Weakness is a death sentence. He straightened, adjusting his prison-issued jacket. When Danning falls, and he will fall, there's going to be a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. You volunteering to fill it? DeShawn asked sarcastically. I'm saying change is coming, Price replied, his gaze still fixed on Rook. And smart men position themselves accordingly. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and counselor? Whatever you've got planned for Danning, I won't interfere. Man's made his own enemies. After Price and his men departed, DeShawn whistled low. Damn, even the Nazis abandoning him. Price sees which way the wind is blowing, Rook observed. He's an opportunist. Could be useful, though, DeShawn suggested. Rook shook his head. We keep our distance. Price's support comes with strings we can't afford. Just saying, enemy of my enemy and all that. In here, Rook replied, echoing Price's words with irony. Everyone is potentially both. That evening, as the prison settled into its nighttime routine, Danning paced the monitoring station of C Block, watching the security feeds with hawkish intensity. He'd assigned himself to direct oversight of the planned sweep, wanting to personally witness any contraband found in Evans's cell. Teams in position? He asked, checking his watch. The control room officer nodded. Ready to move on your mark, Sergeant? Wait, Danning ordered, spotting movement on one of the monitors. What's that? Bottom tier near the showers. The officer zoomed the camera. 2 inmates were engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation, one of them unmistakably Slim. Who's he talking to? Danning demanded, leaning closer to the screen. Looks like Williams, one of Price's guys. Danning's eyes narrowed. First, Slim had been seen with Rook's crew. Now he was consorting with Price's people. The pieces clicked into place in his mind. Hold the sweep, he ordered suddenly. Sir? The officer looked confused. I said hold it, new plan. Danning grabbed his radio. Have inmate Benson brought to interview room 3 immediately. 20 minutes later, Slim sat trembling in the small, windowless room, his eyes darting between Danning and the closed door. I haven't done nothing, Sergeant, I swear, he stammered. Danning circled the table slowly. You know what I see when I look at you, Slim? His voice was dangerously soft. I see a rat who's forgotten which ship he's on. I don't know. What you mean? Danning slammed his hand on the table, making Slim flinch. You've been playing both sides, feeding me scraps while working with Evans. No, Don't lie to me, Danning roared, grabbing Slim by the collar and hauling him halfway across the table. You think I don't know what's happening? You think... I can't see it. Slim's face contorted with fear. It wasn't my idea. Rook's got something on Danning, that's all I know. Something about a dead inmate. Danning released him, his expression suddenly calm. Too calm. What dead inmate? Johnson, Slim gasped, straightening his shirt with shaking hands. The suicide in solitary 3 years back. Rook's got some report that says it wasn't suicide. And where would he get something like that? Slim shook his head desperately. I don't know, I swear. He keeps everything compartmentalized. Nobody knows the whole plan. But there is a plan, Danning pressed. Yes, Slim admitted, his survival instinct overwhelming any loyalty. He's trying to bring you down, turn the guards against you, even the warden. Danning nodded slowly, processing this confirmation of his suspicions. And Price, what's his role? Price just sees opportunity, Slim said quickly. Rook reached out to him, suggested an alliance against you, but Price is playing his own angle. I see. Danning's voice was eerily controlled now. Thank you for your honesty, Slim. Finally. Slim exhaled in relief. So we're good? Oh, we're far from good. Danning moved to the door, opening it to reveal 2 guards waiting outside. Take Mr. Benson to the hole. Indefinite administrative segregation. Slim's eyes widened in horror. You can't do that. They'll know I talked. I'm dead if word gets out. Should have thought about that before you played both sides, Danning replied coldly. As the guards dragged Slim away, his desperate pleas echoing down the corridor, Danning turned to O'Shea, who had been waiting nearby. Change of plans, no cell sweep tonight. O'Shea frowned. Then what? Something more direct. Danning's expression was granite. Rook wants to play games? Fine, but we're changing the rules. What exactly are you planning? O'Shea asked, unease evident in his voice. Justice, O'Shea. Danning's smile didn't reach his eyes. Swift, decisive justice. As O'Shea watched him stride away, radio in hand issuing orders, a cold certainty settled in his gut. Danning wasn't just fighting to maintain control anymore. He was fighting for survival, and men fighting for survival rarely concerned themselves with rules or restraint. The storm that had been brewing was about to break. The raid came at 3:17 a.m., that dead hour when even the most hardened inmates succumbed to sleep. The thunderous crash of cell doors being manually overridden echoed through C-block like artillery fire. On your feet, hands against the wall. The shouts came in unison as guards stormed the tier, batons drawn. Rook was already awake, sitting calmly on the edge of his bunk. He'd been expecting this, though perhaps not with such theatrics. As his cell door slid open, he rose smoothly. Assuming the position without being told a second time, Sergeant Danning entered last, flanked by 4 guards Rook recognized as his most loyal followers. The sergeant's face was a rigid mask of authority, but his eyes burned with something darker. Cell search, Evans, Danning announced, his voice, carrying deliberately so the entire block could hear. Intelligence suggests you're holding contraband. Rook said nothing, maintaining his position against the wall as the guards began methodically destroying his cell. Books were ripped open, his thin mattress slashed and gutted, the toilet checked for hidden compartments. Nothing was spared. What a surprise, Danning drawled after several minutes, holding up a sharpened piece of metal that had mysteriously appeared under Rook's mattress. Looks like a shank to me. That's not mine, Rook stated calmly. They all say that. Danning smiled thinly, dropping the weapon into an evidence bag. How about this? He held up a small cell phone that one of his men had found taped beneath the sink. Rook met his gaze steadily. We both know those weren't here 10 minutes ago. Danning stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Rook could hear. What I know is that you've been causing problems, stirring things up, spreading lies. His eyes narrowed. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? I think, Rook replied, quietly, that when a man starts planting evidence, it means he's run out of legitimate options. Something dangerous flashed across Danning's face. Cuff him, he ordered. Administrative segregation pending investigation. As the cold metal closed around his wrists, Rook addressed the sergeant one final time. You're making a mistake. The only mistake was letting you think you could challenge me, Danning replied. He turned to the other guards. Continue down the tier. Carter's cell is next. DeShawn heard them coming. The commotion from Rook's cell had awakened the entire block, and whispers had already spread about what was happening. He sat up on his bunk, muscles tensed, knowing his turn was next. Unlike Rook, patience had never been his strength. When the cell door crashed open, DeShawn remained seated, eyeing the 4 guards who entered with undisguised contempt. Against the wall, Carter, ordered Peterson, one of Danning's most brutal enforcers. For what? DeShawn asked, not moving. Cell search. Don't make this difficult. DeShawn glanced past them to where Danning watched from the doorway. Planting evidence in Rook's cell wasn't enough, now you gotta do mine too? Peterson stepped forward, baton raised. Last warning. On your feet against the wall. DeShawn rose slowly, his imposing frame making the cell seem even smaller. This ain't right and you know it, he said, addressing not just Peterson but all the guards present. Y'all just following orders, or you enjoy being Danning's puppets? Shut your mouth, Peterson snapped, shoving DeShawn roughly against the wall. The tension was a living thing, filling the small space with the inevitability of violence. DeShawn complied, placing his hands against the concrete, but his shoulders remained rigid with defiance. "Search him first," Danning ordered from the doorway. Peterson holstered his baton and began a pat-down, his movements deliberately rough. When he reached DeShawn's waistband, he yanked hard, a clear provocation. "Easy, man," DeShawn warned. "Quiet," Peterson hissed, shoving him harder. Against the wall, his hand dipped into DeShawn's pocket and suddenly he stepped back. "Got something." He held up a small homemade blade. DeShawn's eyes widened. "That's not mine. You just put that there." "Resisting search and in possession of a weapon," Danning announced loudly. "Restrain him." Peterson moved in with cuffs, but this time DeShawn pivoted, his massive arm swinging up to knock the guard's hand away. "I ain't going down for something I didn't do." The guards converged instantly. Batons raised, they drove DeShawn back against the wall with ruthless efficiency. A blow to the kidneys dropped him to one knee. Another across his shoulders sent him sprawling. "Stop resisting!" Peterson shouted, bringing his baton down again. DeShawn managed to catch the descending baton, wrenching it from Peterson's grasp. "This is bullshit and you know it!" he roared, struggling to regain his footing as the other guards closed in. It was the justification Danning had been waiting for. "Code Blue, C block," he called into his radio. "Violent inmate, officers in danger." Within seconds, the corridor outside filled with the pounding of boots as the prison's rapid response team arrived, riot shields raised and pepper spray at the ready. DeShawn, seeing the overwhelming force assembling, finally raised his hands in surrender. All right, I'm complying." But it was too late. Danning gave the signal, and the response team stormed the cell, driving DeShawn to the ground beneath a pile of armored bodies. Even as he ceased struggling, the blows continued, calculated hits to ribs, kidneys, joints, damage that would leave minimal external evidence but maximum pain. From the doorway, Danning watched with cold satisfaction. "Secure the inmate," he ordered finally. "Solitary confinement, pending assault charges on correctional officers." As they dragged DeShawn's battered form from the cell, his eyes found Danning's. There was no fear in them, only a promise that sent an involuntary chill down the sergeant's spine. O'Shea stood at the monitoring station, watching the footage of the raids with growing unease. He'd been assigned to central control for the duration of the operation, kept away from direct participation in what was unfolding. Now he understood why. "Jesus," he muttered, as the camera showed DeShawn being carried out, his face bloody and swollen. "Standard procedure for violent resistance," commented Lieutenant Jenkins, who was overseeing the control room. "You go soft on them, they think they can get away with anything." O'Shea said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he watched the guards moving methodically down the tier, cell by cell. This wasn't standard procedure. This was a purge, targeting anyone known to associate with Rook. His radio crackled. "O'Shea," Danning's voice. "Report to the segregation unit. I need you to process some new arrivals." "Yes, sir," he replied automatically, though dread pooled in his stomach. The segregation unit, colloquially known as the Hole, occupied the lowest level of Midland's oldest wing. As O'Shea descended the stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air heavy with the particular damp chill that never seemed to leave these underground corridors. Rook was already there, seated calmly on a processing bench, hands cuffed in front of him. Despite the chaos of the night, his composure remained unbroken. "Officer O'Shea," he acknowledged quietly. "Evans." O'Shea glanced around, ensuring they were momentarily alone. "You okay?" "I've been better," Rook admitted. "DeShawn?" O'Shea grimaced. "They worked him over pretty good. He's on his way down." Rook nodded, unsurprised. "And the others?" "At least 7 more arrests so far. Anyone Danning thinks is part of your crew." O'Shea leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This is insane. He's fabricating evidence, provoking confrontations." "Yes," Rook agreed simply. "He is." O'Shea studied him with confusion. "You don't seem worried." "Worried?" "No. Concern for my friends, yes." Rook's eyes held O'Shea's, Danning's showing his true nature now, without the veneer of procedure or policy. How many guards do you think are comfortable with what they're seeing? Before O'Shea could respond, the security door opened, and Danning entered with 2 guards dragging DeShawn between them. The big man's legs barely supported his weight as they deposited him roughly on a bench across from Rook. "Processing them together, Sergeant?" O'Shea asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Changed my mind," Danning replied, eyes never leaving Rook. "I want them to understand exactly what they've lost. What happens when you challenge the natural order?" Rook remained silent, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he took in DeShawn's condition. "Evans here is headed for extended administrative segregation," Danning continued. "Possession of weapons and communication devices. Could add years to his sentence." He smiled thinly. "Carter's looking at new charges of assaulting correctional officers. That's federal time." "This is straight-up persecution," DeShawn managed through split lips. "This," Danning corrected, "is consequences. Something you animals seem to have trouble understanding." He turned to O'Shea. "Process them both for maximum security segregation. No privileges, no visitation, no communication with other inmates." "For how long?" O'Shea asked. "Indefinitely." Danning's tone ended the discussion. He exited, leaving O'Shea alone with the 2 inmates. Once the door closed, O'Shea moved quickly to check DeShawn's injuries. "Can you breathe okay? Any feeling like internal bleeding?" DeShawn winced as O'Shea probed a particularly tender spot on his ribs. "I'll live. Ain't my first beating." "This isn't right," O'Shea muttered, fetching a first aid kit from the wall cabinet. "Even if you had contraband, the response was excessive." "Now you're getting it," Rook said quietly. "This isn't about contraband or rule violations. It's about power and fear. Always has been." O'Shea handed DeShawn some gauze for his bleeding lip. "I need to report this." "To who?" DeShawn scoffed. "Warden? He's in Danning's pocket. State authorities? They don't give a damn what happens to us. There are procedures, protocols, that only work when people in power choose to follow them," Rook interjected. "The system is designed to protect itself, Officer O'Shea, not those it claims to serve." O'Shea fell silent, the weight of this truth settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. After a moment, he began the processing paperwork, his movements mechanical. "They're going to isolate you from everyone," he said finally. "Try to break you." "They can try," Rook replied with quiet certainty. O'Shea hesitated, then lowered his voice further. "Whatever you started, is it worth all this?" Rook's gaze was steady. "Ask yourself this. If a system can only maintain control through brutality and fear, does it deserve to stand?" Before O'Shea could answer, the door opened again, and 2 more guards arrived to escort the prisoners to their segregation cells. "Processing complete?" one asked. O'Shea nodded, handing over the clipboards. "All documented." As they led Rook away, he glanced back at O'Shea one final time. No words were exchanged, but the message in his eyes was clear. Bear witness. For 3 days, Midland Correctional Facility remained on modified lockdown. Danning's purge had resulted in 11 inmates transferred to segregation, all with alleged connections to Rook. The general population seethed with quiet fury, but with the key leaders isolated, no organized resistance materialized. On the surface, order had been restored. Danning had crushed the threat to his authority swiftly and decisively, or so he believed. On the 4th morning, Warden Holloway summoned him to his office. Danning arrived to find the warden reviewing incident reports, his expression unreadable. "Sit down, Ray," Holloway ordered without looking up. Danning remained standing. "I prefer to—" "I said sit." Holloway's tone left no room for argument. Danning complied reluctantly, unaccustomed to being addressed this way by the warden. 11 inmates in segregation. Holloway began tapping the stack of reports. Multiple allegations of excessive force. A dozen contraband weapons mysteriously discovered in cells that were searched just weeks ago with no findings. He finally looked up, eyes hard. And all of it centered around inmates, connected to Jamal Evans. I was addressing a security threat, Danning replied stiffly. Evans was organizing resistance, undermining authority. And how's that working out? Holloway asked, his voice dangerously soft. Because from where I sit, you've turned a smoldering problem into a wildfire. He slid a different paper across the desk. This arrived this morning, an official complaint filed with the State Department of Corrections, alleging systematic abuse and corruption at Midland, specifically naming you. Danning's face darkened. Evans couldn't have filed that from segregation. He didn't, Holloway confirmed. It came through official channels from an attorney in the city. Apparently Evans has outside resources we weren't aware of. So what? It's one complaint. One complaint that references the Marcus Johnson case, Holloway snapped, and mentions other incidents we've kept quiet over the years. One complaint that's now requiring me to submit formal responses to the Oversight Committee. Danning leaned forward. We've handled worse. Have we? Holloway's laugh was bitter. Because your handling of Evans has turned him into a martyr. The inmates see him taking a stand and paying the price. Guards are whispering about fabricated evidence. And now we have official scrutiny. What exactly are you suggesting? Danning demanded. I'm not suggesting anything, Holloway replied coldly. I'm telling you to fix this mess without creating a bigger one. Evans has information that could damage us both. Find out how extensive it is, who else has it, and contain the situation. His eyes narrowed. And Ray? If you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can. The threat hung in the air between them, explicit in its clarity. In the dim confines of his segregation cell, Rook sat cross-legged on the narrow concrete slab that served as a bed. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, but his mind was far from still. The isolation was meant to break him, cut off from information, from allies, from hope itself. But Rook had prepared for this possibility long before Danning made his move. The sound of the meal slot opening broke his meditation. A tray slid through, followed by a hushed voice. 2 minutes, O'Shea whispered. Security cameras on loop. Rook moved to the door. DeShawn? Holding up. They're keeping him in medical segregation. Bruised kidney, 2 cracked ribs. The others? All in isolation, but word's getting out anyway. The whole prison knows what Danning did. O'Shea paused. The complaint was received. State investigators are scheduled to visit next week. Rook nodded, unsurprised. He'd arranged the failsafe weeks ago. Documentation entrusted to a former client now working at a civil rights firm. Danning's panicking, O'Shea continued. Called in sick yesterday. First time in 10 years according to the duty roster. When, he did show up today, he looked like hell. And the warden? Damage control mode. He's distancing himself from the whole situation. O'Shea checked his watch nervously. I need to go. Camera loop won't last much longer. One more thing, Rook said quickly. I need you to get a message to Carlos in the library. Tell him it's time for package 2. What's package 2? Rook's expression was resolute. The next piece of the puzzle. After O'Shea departed, Rook returned to his meditation position, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Danning had struck hard, hoping to demonstrate his power. Instead, he'd revealed his desperation. In the predatory ecosystem of prison, blood in the water only attracted more sharks. The prison cafeteria had always operated on unspoken rules, invisible, boundaries that separated racial groups, factions, and alliances. For as long as anyone could remember, these divisions had been enforced with brutal efficiency, often with the tacit approval of guards who preferred predictable tensions to unexpected chaos. But 8 days after Rook's removal to segregation, something remarkable happened. Carlos Mendez, normally seated with the Latino contingent, deliberately carried his tray to a table occupied by black inmates. In the sudden silence that followed, he nodded to the men and quietly took a seat. Moments later, 2 Asian inmates did the same at another table, breaking years of self-imposed separation. From his position at the guard station overlooking the cafeteria, Officer Jenkins tensed, hand moving to his radio. "This ain't right," he muttered to his colleague. "We should shut this down before it spreads." His fellow guard, Peterson, shook his head. "Danning's orders are to report any unusual activities, not intervene." "Since when does Danning want us standing back?" "Since everything went to hell last week," Peterson replied grimly. "He wants to see who's organizing this." By the meal's end, a dozen traditional seating arrangements had been broken, with inmates from different races and factions deliberately mixing. No words were exchanged about Rook, DeShawn, or the purge that had landed 11 men in segregation, but the message was unmistakable. The old divisions were temporarily suspended in the face of a common enemy. In the administration building, Danning reviewed security camera footage from the cafeteria, his face darkening with each frame. "It's coordinated," he told Captain Harris, who stood nearby. "They're signaling solidarity with Evans." "Without saying a word," Harris noted. "Smart. Gives us no pretext to crack down." Danning slammed his fist on the desk. "Evans is in isolation. How the hell is he still pulling strings?" Harris shrugged. "Man's got influence. Always has. Influence requires communication. Someone's passing messages." Danning rewound the footage, studying the faces of the guards on duty. "One of our own is helping him." "That's a serious accusation," Harris warned. "You start suspecting fellow officers without proof, you'll lose what support you have left." Danning's head snapped up. "What's that supposed to mean?" Harris sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Look, Ray, I've backed your play for years. We all have, but lately, things are different." He gestured to the screens. "You've got inmates organizing across racial lines, guards questioning orders, and a state investigation coming. The warden's running scared." "So that's it? Everyone's jumping ship at the first sign of trouble?" "No one's jumping ship," Harris replied firmly. "But you need to recognize that your methods have consequences. That contraband you found in Evans' cell, half the guards on duty knew it was planted. The beating Carter took, excessive by any standard. Since when do you care about these animals' welfare?" "Since your vendetta started threatening all of us." Harris met his gaze steadily. "The system works because we maintain the appearance of rules and order. Break that too, obviously, and the whole thing collapses." Danning leaned back, studying his longtime colleague with new eyes. "You too, then? Everyone turning on me?" "Nobody's turning on you," Harris replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "But you need to clean this up before it gets worse." After Harris departed, Danning remained at the monitors, scanning faces, searching for the traitor he was certain existed among his ranks. One face in particular drew his attention. O'Shea, the young guard who had once looked up to him with admiration. Recently, that admiration had been replaced by something else. Doubt, perhaps even disgust. Danning's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. If there was a leak, O'Shea was the most likely candidate. Marcus "Slim" Benson had survived his stint in segregation through careful negotiation, trading what little information he had for protection. After 6 days, he'd been released back into general population, a decision Danning had reluctantly approved in the hope that Slim might lead him to others involved in Rook's network. Now, as Slim made his way cautiously through the yard, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes tracking his movement. Word had spread about his role in the events leading to the purge. In prison, the label of snitch was a death sentence, only delayed by the protective umbrella Danning had extended. An umbrella that grew more tattered by the day. Slim. The voice came from behind him. Ethan Price, flanked by 2 of his Aryan Brotherhood soldiers. "Got a minute?" Slim froze, adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm heading back inside," he stammered. "Got an appointment with Danning to report on what you see out here?" Price's smile was predatory. "That's exactly what we need to discuss." Before Slim could respond, Price's men had steered him behind the weight pile, out of direct view from the guard towers. Not so hidden as to trigger immediate intervention, but private enough for the conversation Price intended. "Please," Slim whispered. "I didn't tell them anything about you or your business." "I know," Price replied calmly. "You told them about Evans, about Carter, about men who were trying to fix a broken system." His voice hardened. "Men who were actually standing up for something. I was just trying to survive. Aren't we all?" Price gestured to the yard, where inmates from various factions were mingling with unprecedented freedom. "Look around you. Something's changing. The old rules, the old hatreds, they're being set aside because people see a bigger enemy." Slim followed his gaze, recognizing the truth in Price's words. "What do you want from me?" "Information." Price leaned closer. "Danning's desperate, dangerous. I need to know what he's planning." "Why would I tell you that? He'd kill me." "Maybe." Price nodded thoughtfully. "But if you don't, I guarantee others will. Right now, the only thing keeping you breathing is the possibility you might be useful." He straightened up. "Think it over, but not too long." As Price and his men walked away, Slim's gaze darted frantically around the yard, seeking any sign of Danning or his loyal guards. Finding none, he hurried toward the entrance, unaware of the dozens of inmates who had witnessed the exchange. By lights out, everyone in Midland knew that Slim's protection was evaporating, and that Price, once Danning's most reliable ally among the inmates, had publicly severed that connection. In the records room deep within the administration building, Mark O'Shea worked methodically through stacks of old security logs. His assignment, a punishment detail authorized by Danning, was to digitize years of paper records, a mind-numbing task typically reserved for the lowest-ranking officers. But what Danning intended as disciplinary busy work had become an unexpected opportunity. 3 hours into his shift, O'Shea found what he didn't even know he was looking for: the original duty log from the night Marcus Johnson died. Unlike the sanitized official report that documented a routine cell check followed by the discovery of Johnson's suicide, the handwritten log told a different story. 22:37. Sergeant Danning requests cell extraction team for C-206, Johnson, M, 2242. Extraction team assembled. Cooper Lewis Marsden. 22:155. Inmate Johnson secured and removed for disciplinary interview. Room B, 0014. Inmate Johnson returned to cell. Medical attention declined 0221. Officer Cooper reports medical emergency C-206. Inmate unresponsive 02.35. Medical declares inmate Johnson deceased. Apparent suicide by hanging. O'Shea stared at the entry, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. This wasn't just procedural misconduct, it was the smoking gun that connected Danning directly to Johnson's death. The official report had omitted the cell extraction and disciplinary interview entirely, creating the fiction that Johnson had simply been found dead during routine rounds. With trembling hands, O'Shea photographed the log with his phone, then carefully replaced it in the file. His mind raced with the weight of what he'd discovered and the decision that now loomed before him. Turning in this evidence meant not just ending Danning's career, but potentially his own as well. The thin, blue line didn't forgive betrayal, and whistleblowers rarely found welcome anywhere in law enforcement again, but keeping silent meant being complicit in a cover-up that had allowed a murderer to continue wielding power that had most recently been used to brutalize DeShawn and imprison Rook on fabricated charges. As O'Shea completed his shift and headed for the exit, Danning appeared in the corridor, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. "O'Shea," he called, voice deceptively casual. "Find anything interesting in those old logs?" O'Shea forced his expression to remain neutral. "Just routine reports, Sergeant. Nothing worth noting." Danning studied him, eyes searching for any hint of deception. "You sure about that? You seemed pretty focused in there." "Just trying to get through the assignment, sir." O'Shea met his gaze steadily. "Records keeping isn't exactly exciting work." "No, it isn't," Danning agreed, his tone softening into something almost paternal. "Look, Mark, I know things have been tense lately, You've seen sides of this job that aren't pretty. But everything I do, everything, is about maintaining order, in a place that would descend into chaos without firm control. O'Shea nodded non-committally. I understand the challenges, sir. Do you? Danning moved closer. Because I've noticed you pulling away, questioning orders, spending time with inmates like Evans. His voice hardened slightly. That kind of behavior makes me wonder where your loyalties lie. My loyalty is to doing my job properly, O'Shea replied, choosing his words carefully. Good. Danning's hand came to rest on O'Shea's shoulder, the friendly gesture belied by the pressure of his fingers. Because in this place we only have each other. Inmates will lie, manipulate, promise anything to drive wedges between us. Don't let Evans get in your head. He hasn't, sir. Glad to hear it. Danning released him with a pat that was almost a shove. Because I'd hate to think one of my own officers was working against me. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Get some rest, Danning added, already turning away. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. As O'Shea watched him go, the weight of the evidence on his phone seemed to burn in his pocket. The choice before him had never been clearer, or more dangerous. Warden Ernest Holloway had built his career on political instinct, knowing when to press forward, when to retreat, and most importantly, when to cut ties with liabilities. As he reviewed the latest communication from the State Department of Corrections regarding the upcoming investigation, that instinct screamed a clear warning. Danning had become a liability. The intercom on his desk buzzed. Sergeant Danning is here to see you, sir. Holloway straightened his tie and closed the file. Send him in. Danning entered, looking more haggard than Holloway had ever seen him. The sergeant's usual crisp appearance had given way to something harder, rawer, a man running on adrenaline and anger rather than discipline. You wanted to see me? Danning asked, remaining standing despite the warden's gesture toward a chair. I did. Holloway leaned back, fingers steepled. The situation has deteriorated further since our last conversation. I'm handling it, Danning insisted. Are you? Holloway's eyebrows rose. Because from where I sit, you've lost control of... Your officers lost the cooperation of key inmate factions and created a unity among prisoner groups that hasn't existed in 20 years. He slid a paper across the desk. And now this. Danning picked up the document, a formal notice of investigation from the State Department of Corrections, citing specific allegations of prisoner abuse, evidence tampering, and procedural violations. They're sending a 3-person team next Tuesday, Holloway continued, with authority to interview inmates privately, review all records, and examine physical evidence. We've been through inspections before, Danning replied, though his confidence sounded hollow even to his own ears. Inspections, yes. Full investigations triggered by specific allegations with supporting evidence. That's new territory. Holloway's voice hardened. And I won't allow your personal vendetta against Evans to bring down this institution or my career. So what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm giving you a direct order. Holloway rose, emphasizing the authority gap between them. Clean this up. Immediately. Whatever personal history exists between you and Evans, whatever he knows about Johnson or any other incidents, neutralize it. How am I supposed to do that with him in segregation under official protection pending investigation? I don't care how you do it, Holloway replied coldly. But if those investigators arrive and find evidence that substantiates these allegations, I will ensure you face the consequences alone. He paused, letting the words sink in. Is that clear, Sergeant? Danning's jaw tightened. Crystal clear? Warden. Good, you have 5 days. Use them wisely. After Danning departed, Holloway returned to his window, gazing out at the prison yard below. For almost a decade, Danning had been his most valuable asset. The man who kept Midland's complex racial dynamics in check, who ensured problems were solved before they reached administrative level, who maintained the illusion of rehabilitation. while the reality of control continued uninterrupted. But assets became liabilities when they drew unwanted attention. And Danning, in his obsession with breaking Evans, had crossed that line. Holloway picked up his phone, dialing a private number. "It's Holloway. I need cleanup protocols prepared. Full documentation purge. Select files only." He paused. "Yes, including the Johnson case. Everything." The warden had survived in corrections this long by recognizing when sacrifices were necessary. As he hung up, he made a mental note to begin, drafting the press release that would accompany Danning's eventual dismissal. A statement expressing shock and disappointment that would distance the administration from the actions of a rogue officer. In politics, as in prison, survival often meant knowing when to step away from a sinking ship. In his segregation cell, Rook received O'Shea's whispered update through the meal slot with characteristic calm. "You found the actual log?" he confirmed, voice low. "With documentation of the cell extraction before Johnson's death?" O'Shea nodded grimly. "It completely contradicts the official report. Proves Danning had Johnson removed for a disciplinary interview hours before he supposedly committed suicide. And you have proof? Something that can't be destroyed or altered?" "Photos on my phone." O'Shea glanced nervously down the corridor. "But I don't know what to do with them. Danning suspects something. He's watching me." Rook considered this. "The state investigators arrived Tuesday?" "Yes, 3-person team with full authority." "Then you have a decision to make," Rook said quietly. "Whether to bring that evidence forward, knowing what it might cost you." O'Shea's face tightened. "It's not that simple. You don't understand what happens to officers who break ranks." "I understand exactly what happens to people who stand against corrupt systems," Rook countered. "I've lived it. The question isn't whether there's a cost. There always is. The question is whether truth and justice are worth that cost." Before O'Shea could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. He quickly closed the meal slot, resuming his routine check as another guard appeared. "Everything okay here, O'Shea?" Officer Peterson asked, eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Fine," O'Shea replied, gesturing to his clipboard. "Just finishing the segregation checks." Peterson studied him for a moment longer, then nodded curtly. "Danning wants to see you when you're done. Says it's important." After Peterson departed, O'Shea stood motionless outside Rook's cell, the weight of his discovery and the looming confrontation with Danning pressing down on him like a physical burden. In his pocket, the phone containing evidence that could end Danning's career, and possibly his own, seemed to pulse with dangerous potential. The choice before him was stark: maintain the corrupt system that had protected Danning for years, or risk everything to break it open. As he walked away from the segregation unit, O'Shea felt something he hadn't experienced since his first days at Midland: absolute moral clarity. The officer he had aspired to be, the man he had wanted to become, would know exactly what to do. The only question was whether he had the courage to do it. Morning shift change at Midland was typically routine, a methodical handover of keys, equipment, and information as one group of officers departed and another arrived. But on this particular morning, the atmosphere in the staff room crackled with unusual tension. Mark O'Shea had arrived an hour early, bypassing the regular entrance and instead requesting access to the administrative offices where the prison's Internal Affairs Division maintained their small, rarely visited suite. The decision had crystallized, in the pre-dawn hours after a sleepless night, a clarity born not of confidence but of the simple understanding that he could no longer live with himself otherwise. Internal Affairs. Lieutenant Paula Winters regarded him impassively from across her desk, neither encouraging nor discouraging as he explained what he had discovered. "You understand the seriousness of these allegations," she said after he finished. It wasn't a question. "I do." O'Shea's voice was steadier than he expected. "And I have evidence to substantiate them." He slid his phone across the desk, the screen displaying the damning security log. Winters examined it carefully, her expression unchanging. You know what happens to officers who bring accusations against their own. I do, he repeated. She studied him for a long moment. Why now, O'Shea? Danning's methods aren't exactly new. Because I can't be part of it anymore, he replied simply. Not after seeing what he did to Carter, not after knowing what he did to Johnson, not after watching him plant evidence to frame Evans. Winters nodded slowly, then reached for her desk phone. Wait outside. This needs to go up the chain immediately. 20 minutes later, a grim-faced Winters emerged from her office. The warden wants to see you, now. Ernest Holloway had built a career on political survival, which required above all else the ability to read changing winds and adjust course accordingly. The moment O'Shea entered his office, Holloway knew exactly which way those winds were blowing. Officer O'Shea, he greeted, his tone grave but not unfriendly. Lieutenant Winters has briefed me on your concerns. Please have a seat. O'Shea remained standing. I'd prefer to stand, sir. As you wish. Holloway leaned back, studying the young officer. What you've brought forward is deeply troubling. If substantiated, it suggests serious misconduct by Sergeant Danning. It's substantiated, sir, O'Shea replied. The log is clear. Johnson was removed from his cell by Danning's order hours before his supposed suicide. The official report omitted this entirely. Yes, so you've said? Holloway's expression shifted to one of somber concern. I want you to know that I take these allegations very seriously. The safety and proper treatment of inmates is my highest priority, regardless of their crimes. The hypocrisy was so blatant that O'Shea almost laughed. Instead, he kept his face carefully neutral. I'm glad to hear that, Warden. I've already initiated emergency protocols, Holloway continued. Sergeant Danning will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending full investigation. The state team arriving Tuesday will be notified of these new developments. O'Shea hadn't expected such swift action. And the evidence? Will be preserved and documented according to proper procedure, Holloway assured him. In fact, I'd like you to work directly with Lieutenant Winters to ensure everything is properly handled. He rose, extending his hand. Your courage in coming forward is commendable, Officer O'Shea. The sudden pivot to ally himself with O'Shea was transparently self-serving, but it confirmed what O'Shea had suspected. Holloway had already been preparing to sacrifice Danning to save himself. As he shook the warden's hand, O'Shea realized he'd been granted a temporary immunity. The administration couldn't punish him now without appearing to retaliate against a whistleblower, especially with state investigators due to arrive. Thank you, sir, he replied, the words ashen in his mouth. I'm just doing what's right. Indeed. Holloway's smile was thin. Now, I believe you have a regularly scheduled shift in C Block. We should maintain normal operations as much as possible during this transition. It was a dismissal, but also a test. Would O'Shea continue his duties alongside the very colleagues who would now see him as a traitor? Yes, sir. I'll report for duty as scheduled. As he turned to leave, Holloway added, One more thing, Officer O'Shea. It would be best if you refrained from discussing this matter with other staff or inmates until the official announcement later today. For the integrity of the process, of course. Of course, O'Shea agreed, recognizing the attempt to control the narrative. Will that be all, Warden? For now. Holloway's eyes hardened slightly. But I'll be watching your work closely in the coming days, Officer O'Shea. Very closely indeed. The implied threat was clear. O'Shea might have won this battle, but his war with the system was just beginning. Sergeant Ray Danning was finishing his morning coffee when Captain Harris and Lieutenant Winters entered the officers' mess, their expressions grave. The room fell silent as they approached his table. Sergeant Danning, Winters began formally, I need you to come with us to the administrative offices. Danning set down his cup slowly. What's this about, Winters? It's a private matter, she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. The other officers in the mess watched with barely concealed interest. Danning could feel their eyes on him. sensed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't a routine summons. "Fine," he said, rising from his chair with deliberate casualness. "Lead the way." They escorted him not to the warden's office as he expected, but to the internal affairs suite, a destination that sent a cold spike of alarm through him. Inside, Warden Holloway waited alongside two senior officers Danning didn't recognize. The setup was unmistakable, an official disciplinary proceeding. "What the hell is this?" Danning demanded, his composure slipping. "Sergeant Danning," Holloway began, his voice formal and distant. "Serious allegations have been brought to our attention regarding misconduct during your tenure at Midland Correctional Facility." "What allegations?" Danning's eyes narrowed. "Who's making these claims?" "The source is protected," Winters interjected, "but the evidence is substantial and credible." "Evidence of what?" Danning's voice rose. "I've given 23 years to this facility. I've kept order when no one else could. Whatever some inmate is claiming, it's not an inmate," Holloway cut in coldly. "It's one of your own officers, with documented proof that you falsified reports regarding the death of inmate Marcus Johnson in 2022. The blood drained from Danning's face. That's absurd." "Is it?" Holloway nodded to Winters, who slid a folder across the table. Inside was a photocopy of the security log O'Shea had discovered, alongside the contradictory official report bearing Danning's signature. "The log clearly shows you ordered Johnson removed from his cell for what you termed a disciplinary interview hours before his death." Holloway continued. "The official report omits this entirely, creating a false narrative of routine checks, followed by the discovery of suicide." Danning stared at the documents, mind racing. "This is a mistake, that log. It could be a forgery." "It's an original prison record maintained in our secure archives," Winters replied. "And there's more. Multiple officers have now come forward, expressing concerns about recent events, specifically the allegations of planted evidence in Jamal Evans's cell and excessive force used against DeShawn Carter." "Bullshit," Danning slammed his hand on the table. "Every action I took was necessary for security and order. Evans was organizing resistance, undermining authority." "That's enough, Sergeant," Holloway interrupted, his tone ice cold. "Effective. Immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending full investigation. You will surrender your badge, keys, and any prison property in your possession before leaving the facility." "You can't do this," Danning protested, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. "Not after everything I've done. Not after the messes I've cleaned up for you, Ernest." A flash of warning crossed Holloway's features. "I'd advise against making unfounded accusations, Sergeant. It will only complicate your situation." He nodded to Harris. "Please escort Sergeant Danning to clean out his locker, then off the premises." As Harris led him from the room, Danning's mind reeled with the sudden reversal of fortune. The system he had served so faithfully, the power structure he had enforced for decades, had turned against him with breathtaking speed. And he knew exactly who was responsible. "It was O'Shea, wasn't it?" he demanded as they walked toward the locker room. "He's the one who brought this forward." Harris didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "The kid doesn't know what he's done," Danning muttered. "Evans has gotten into his head, manipulated him." "Ray," Harris replied quietly, "it's over. Don't make it worse by fighting this." They reached the officers' locker room to find it occupied by a half-dozen guards preparing for their shifts. Conversation died as Danning entered, all eyes turning to take in his escort by the captain. "What's going on?" Officer Peterson asked, his gaze shifting between Danning and Harris. "Sergeant Danning is on administrative leave pending investigation," Harris answered formally. "He's here to collect his personal items." The silence that followed was deafening. Danning looked from face to face, searching for support, for the respect and fear he had commanded for so long. Instead, he found carefully averted eyes, guarded expressions, and in some cases, barely concealed relief. "You're all just going to stand there?" Danning's voice cracked slightly. "After everything we've been through? Everything we've done together?" Peterson was the first to respond, his tone carefully neutral. "Sorry to hear about this, Sergeant. I'm sure it'll get sorted out." The platitude was worse than silence. As Danning opened his locker and began emptying it, he felt the weight of collective abandonment pressing down on him. These men, his men, were already distancing themselves, already calculating how his fall would affect their own positions. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, addressing no one in particular. "When I'm gone, this place will descend into chaos. The animals will run the zoo." No one responded. No one needed to. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Danning was no longer a feared authority figure, but a liability to be discarded. By the time he was escorted to the staff exit, word of his suspension had spread throughout the facility. As he passed through security checkpoints, Danning caught guards whispering, saw the barely concealed satisfaction on some faces, the nervous uncertainty on others. At the final checkpoint, he paused, looking back at the prison that had been his domain for more than 2 decades. "This isn't over," he told Harris. "Not by a long shot." Harris sighed. "Go home, Ray. Get a lawyer. Let the process work." But, as Danning walked to his car alone, badge and keys gone, the reality of his situation settled over him like a shroud. The system he had manipulated for so long had finally turned its machinery against him. And for the first time in years, Sergeant Ray Danning felt something he had inflicted on countless others, but never expected to experience himself: genuine fear. Word of Danning's suspension spread through Midland's inmate population like wildfire, transforming the usual atmosphere of tense resignation into something more dangerous: hope. In the prison yard that afternoon, the usual racial divisions had dissolved almost entirely as inmates gathered in mixed groups, discussing the development. In hushed, excited tones, "They actually did it," marveled Carlos, addressing a circle of inmates that would have been unthinkable just days before. "They marched him right out." "Ain't nothing happened yet," cautioned an older black inmate. "Just suspension. Man, like..." Danning got friends in high places. "Not anymore," countered one of Price's associates. "Word is even the warden turned on him. Found some paper trail about that Johnson suicide a few years back." "Wasn't no suicide," another man interjected. "Everybody knew that." Johnson mouthed off to Danning. "Next thing he's hanging in his cell." The conversation paused as Officer O'Shea walked past on his patrol route. Unlike other guards who gave the mixed groups a wide berth, uncertain how to handle this unprecedented breaking of prison social norms, O'Shea moved through the yard with quiet confidence. Once he was out of earshot, Carlos leaned in. "That's the one who turned Danning in," brought the evidence forward. "A guard snitching on another guard?" Someone whistled low. "Never thought I'd see the day." "It's all Rook's doing," Carlos explained. "He's been planning this for months. Getting evidence, building allies, waiting for the right moment. And now they got both him and D-Blade locked in segregation," another inmate noted bitterly. "Can't even enjoy watching Danning fall." "That's gonna change," Carlos assured them. "With Danning gone, there's no reason to keep them isolated. Plus, the state investigation team arrives Tuesday. They got authority to interview any inmate, including those in segregation." The conversation shifted to speculation about what might happen next. The collective mood oscillating between vindication and skepticism. For men accustomed to a system that consistently protected its own, Danning's suspension seemed almost too good to be true. In the medical segregation unit, DeShawn Carter received the news of Danning's downfall from a sympathetic nurse who whispered the update while checking his healing ribs. "For real?" DeShawn's face lit up despite the pain. "They actually suspended him?" The nurse nodded, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard. "Administrative leave pending investigation. Word is they found evidence about some inmate death from years ago." "Johnson," DeShawn confirmed, a grim satisfaction in his voice. Rook was right. The man's past finally caught up with him. After the nurse departed, DeShawn lay back on his narrow bed, a complex mix of emotions washing over him. Satisfaction, certainly. Vindication, absolutely. But also a nagging sense of incompleteness. Administrative leave meant Danning was safely outside the prison walls, beyond the reach of the men he had tormented for years. If the system worked as it was supposed to, a significant if, he might face charges, lose his pension, possibly even serve time. But DeShawn had seen too many instances where the system protected its own, where charges were reduced, where prosecutors declined to pursue cases against law enforcement. Danning deserved more than bureaucratic justice. He deserved to face the men he had brutalized, to experience the fear he had so casually inflicted. He deserved prison justice. When O'Shea appeared at his cell for the evening check, DeShawn was ready. "Heard you're the one who brought him down," he said without preamble. "That took guts." O'Shea glanced around before responding. "I just did. What needed doing?" "Rook know yet?" "I haven't had a chance to tell him directly," O'Shea admitted. "But word travels fast in here." DeShawn nodded, then leaned closer to the bars. "Listen, I need to see him. Face to face. There's things we need to discuss now that Danning's gone." "I can't just transfer you between units without authorization," O'Shea replied. "Even with Danning gone, there are protocols." "Then get authorization," DeShawn pressed. "The state team's coming Tuesday, right? They'll want to interview us. Both anyway. Why not put us together now, save everyone some trouble?" O'Shea hesitated, clearly weighing the request. "I'll see what I can do, but no promises." After he departed, DeShawn returned to his bunk, his mind already formulating the conversation he needed to have with Rook. Danning's suspension was just the beginning. The man needed to pay, truly pay, for what he had done, and DeShawn intended to ensure that happened, with or without the system's blessing. In his segregation cell, Rook received confirmation of Danning's fall from an unlikely source, Warden Holloway himself. The warden arrived unannounced, dismissing the guard on duty with a curt nod before approaching Rook's cell. His demeanor was not that of a prison administrator visiting an inmate, but rather a politician meeting with a respected adversary. "Mr. Evans," he began, his tone carefully modulated, "I thought you should know that Sergeant Danning has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation into misconduct." He paused, studying Rook's reaction. "Specifically regarding the death of inmate Marcus Johnson in 2022 and recent allegations of evidence tampering." Rook rose from his bunk, approaching the cell door with measured steps. "That seems appropriate given the circumstances." "Indeed." Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. "I want to assure you that this administration has zero tolerance for abuse of authority or mistreatment of those in our care." The claim was so blatantly hypocritical that Rook couldn't suppress a small smile. "That's reassuring to hear, Warden, especially from someone who's overseen this facility for the past 9 years. Holloway's jaw tightened momentarily before he regained his political composure. "I also wanted to inform you that your segregation status is under review. Given that the original charges appear to have been questionable, you may be returned to general population pending the state investigation. And my friends, the others placed in segregation during Sergeant Danning's purge? Their cases are being reviewed as well," Holloway replied smoothly. "We want to ensure justice is served appropriately." Rook nodded, recognizing the warden's attempt to position himself on the right side of the emerging narrative. "Justice is all we've ever wanted, Warden." "Good." Holloway straightened his tie, preparing to depart. "Then I trust there won't be any disruptions when you return to the general population. The situation is delicate, and further unrest would not benefit anyone." "I understand completely," Rook assured him. "Control is important to maintain, isn't it?" The double meaning wasn't lost on Holloway. "More than you know, Mr. Evans." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Officer O'Shea has shown considerable courage in bringing forward evidence. I would consider it a personal courtesy if you would encourage your followers to respect his position during this transition." "Officer O'Shea has nothing to fear from us," Rook replied. "He did the right thing, at considerable personal risk. That earns respect, not enmity." Holloway studied him for a moment longer, then nodded curtly before departing. Left alone, Rook returned to his bunk, contemplation replacing the careful composure he'd maintained during the warden's visit. Holloway's appearance confirmed what he had suspected. The administration was scrambling to distance itself from Danning, to rewrite the narrative before external investigators arrived. It was a significant victory, but also a dangerous moment. The system, threatened, was adapting, sacrificing one of its own to preserve its broader structure. The warden's warning about disruptions carried an implicit threat: push too far, demand too much, and the brief window of accountability would slam shut. Moreover, Rook knew that men like DeShawn would not be satisfied with administrative proceedings and formal justice. They wanted Danning to suffer as they had suffered, to experience the fear and helplessness he had inflicted on so many. That desire, while understandable, threatened to undermine everything they had worked for. If inmates took matters into their own hands, it would only reinforce the stereotype of dangerous criminals requiring harsh control, justifying the very system they sought to change. As the lights dimmed for evening lockdown, Rook closed his eyes, mentally preparing for the complex challenge ahead. Danning's removal was not the end, but merely the beginning of a more subtle battle, one fought not with violence or brute force, but with the power of moral authority. The question was whether that authority would be enough to control the righteous anger of men who had endured years of abuse at Danning's hands. 3 days after Danning's suspension, Midland Correctional Facility existed in a state of uneasy transition. The official narrative, carefully crafted by Warden Holloway's administration, described the situation as procedural adjustments following personnel changes. The reality was far more volatile. With Danning gone, the invisible power structures that had maintained order for years were rapidly disintegrating. Guards who had relied on his authority now hesitated to enforce rules with their customary brutality. Inmate factions that had maintained an uneasy peace under his iron fist began testing boundaries, claiming new territory in the yard, the cafeteria, the work assignments. In the middle of this shifting landscape, Jamal, Rook, Evans, and DeShawn, Carter had been released from segregation, their return to general population greeted with the reverence usually reserved for conquering heroes. "Man, I still can't believe it worked," DeShawn said as they sat together in the yard, surrounded by a protective circle of allies. "Danning gone, us back out here, state investigators arriving tomorrow." Rook nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "It's not over yet. The system is adapting, trying to isolate the damage to Danning alone." "Let them try," DeShawn scoffed. "Man's going down, and we all know he wasn't acting alone. Holloway, the other guards, they were all part of it." "True," Rook agreed. "But proving that is another matter." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "What concerns me is this rumor about Danning returning to the facility tomorrow." DeShawn's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "O'Shea told me this morning. Danning's been ordered to return to meet with the state investigation team. Standard procedure. They need his statement, access to his files." "Inside the prison? Why not at their offices?" "Because they want to interview him in proximity to the evidence, the scene of Johnson's death." Rook watched DeShawn's reaction, carefully. "He'll be here under escort, confined to the administrative wing." DeShawn's massive hands clenched into fists. "So the man who beat me half to death, who kept us in solitary on fake charges, who killed Johnson, he just walks back in here like it's nothing?" "Not like it's nothing," Rook corrected. "As a suspect under investigation." "That ain't enough," DeShawn insisted, his voice hardening. "Man needs to face those he hurt, face to face. No badges, no protection." Rook studied his friend with growing concern. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Before DeShawn could answer, their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Carlos, his expression urgent. "We got movement," he reported quietly. "Price wants to meet, says it's important about tomorrow." Rook and DeShawn exchanged glances. An overture from the white supremacist leader was unusual enough to warrant attention, especially given the accelerating breakdown of the prison's traditional racial barriers. "Where?" Rook asked. "Maintenance shed, 15 minutes. Carlos glanced nervously around the yard. "He's bringing 2 of his guys. Says to bring the same." After Carlos departed, DeShawn shook his head. I don't trust that Nazi piece of shit. We don't need to trust him, Rook replied, rising to his feet. But we do need to hear what he has to say. The maintenance shed stood at the far corner of the yard, partially obscured by the shadow of the main building. It was one of the few places in Midland where conversations could occur with relative privacy, a fact known to both inmates and guards. Ethan Price was already waiting when Rook and DeShawn arrived, flanked by his two lieutenants. The white supremacist leader's face bore the hard lines of a man accustomed to violence, his arms covered in crude racist tattoos that told the story of a life dedicated to hate. Counselor, he greeted Rook with a nod, deliberately ignoring DeShawn. Appreciate you coming. What's this about, Price? Rook asked, maintaining a careful distance. Price glanced toward the watchtower, ensuring they weren't being observed too closely. Tomorrow. Danning's coming back. We know. What you might not know is that he's scared. Price's lips curled in contempt. Called in favors with some of my external associates looking for protection. DeShawn's eyebrows rose. Your people on the outside are talking to Danning? Were, Price corrected. They shut him down. Man's toxic now, nobody wants to be associated with him. He shifted his weight, the movement revealing a makeshift weapon concealed at his waistband. But that's not why I called this meeting. Then get to the point, DeShawn growled, his patience visibly thinning. Point is, tomorrow's going to be a shit show. Price looked directly at Rook. My boys are planning to make a move during afternoon. Recreation. Create enough distraction to access the administrative wing. Rook's expression remained neutral. And why are you telling us this? Because I'm not stupid, Price replied. You two have the most influence with the general population right now. When my boys start things, others will join in if they think it's connected to bringing Danning down. He paused, watching their reactions. I want your blessing, or at least your neutrality. You're talking about a riot, Rook stated flatly. Price shrugged. I'm talking about opportunity. Danning will be in the building, vulnerable, without his badge or his power. He leaned closer. Don't pretend you don't want your shot at him too. And after you get to Danning, Rook pressed. What then? Justice, Price spat. Prison justice, not some bureaucratic bullshit that lets him retire with a pension while Johnson stays in the ground. DeShawn shifted, a flash of agreement crossing his features before he masked it. Rook noticed but didn't acknowledge it. This isn't just about Danning for you, Rook observed instead. This is about establishing your control now that he's gone, creating a power vacuum you can fill. Price smiled thinly. Smart man. But does it matter? Our interests align on this one thing. Danning needs to face what he's done. Inside these walls where it happened. We'll consider it, Rook replied non-committally. No promises. Consider it quick, Price advised. It's happening with or without you, but it goes a lot smoother with your support. He gestured to his men, preparing to leave. Let me know by morning count. After Price and his crew departed, DeShawn turned to Rook, his expression troubled. He's not wrong about Danning. No, Rook agreed. But a riot. That plays directly into the administration's hands. They'd love nothing more than to paint this as violent inmates running wild, justify cracking down even harder. So we just let Danning walk in and out, hide behind the process? DeShawn's frustration was palpable. Man, I've followed your lead on everything. The long game, the patience working within the system, and it got us this far. But there comes a point where you gotta draw a line. Rook placed a hand on his friend's massive shoulder. I'm not saying Danning shouldn't face consequences. I'm saying we need to be smarter than Price about how it happens. Then we better figure it out quick, DeShawn replied grimly. Because one way or another, tomorrow's going to be the day. Mark O'Shea's shift the following morning began with an ominous briefing. Captain Harris, now acting as interim head of security in Danning's absence, looked haggard as he addressed the assembled officers. We've received credible intelligence suggesting potential unrest today, he announced. Former Sergeant Danning will be on site from 1300 to 1700 hours for his interview with state investigators. His presence complicates matters. An uneasy murmur swept through the room. "Our orders from administration are to maintain normal operations," Harris continued. "Danning will be escorted directly to the administrative conference room and remain there under supervision for the duration of his interview." "What about yard time?" someone asked. "The schedule has all blocks out for recreation during those hours." Harris's expression tightened. "Schedule remains unchanged. We don't have the personnel for a full lockdown." He paused, scanning the room. "But I want everyone on high alert. Any sign of organized activity reported immediately. Do not engage without backup." As the officers dispersed to their assignments, O'Shea found himself approached by Lieutenant Winters from Internal Affairs. "O'Shea," she said quietly, "a word." They moved to a corner of the room, away from the others. "I need you for a special assignment today," she began without preamble. "Danning's escort." O'Shea stared at her in disbelief. "You want me to escort Danning? After I'm the one who turned him in?" "Precisely because you turned him in," Winters replied. "The warden thinks it sends the right message to the state team that we're taking this seriously, that we put accountability above internal loyalty. It's a PR move," O'Shea realized, "using me as a prop." "Call it what you want." Winters's voice hardened. "But it's also the safest option for Danning. No one will suspect you of helping him if something goes wrong." "If something goes wrong?" O'Shea repeated slowly. "You're expecting trouble." Winters glanced around before responding. "The temperature in here is too high. Inmates know Danning's coming back. They want their pound of flesh." She fixed him with a penetrating stare. "Your job is to make sure they don't get it, for his sake and for the integrity of the investigation." After she left, O'Shea leaned against the wall, the weight of the assignment settling over him. He had exposed Danning's crimes out of moral conviction, but he had never wanted the man harmed. Justice through proper channels, not violence. That had been the principle motivating his actions. But as he prepared for his shift, a nagging doubt crept in. In a place like Midland, were proper channels even possible? Or was violence simply another form of justice for men who had been denied all other recourse? By midday, the atmosphere throughout Midland had taken on the electric tension that precedes a storm. In the cafeteria, conversations happened in hushed tones, with frequent glances toward the guards. In the cell blocks, men prepared, some fashioning makeshift weapons, others establishing alibis, all understanding that something significant was approaching. Rook spent the morning in careful conversation with key influencers across the prison's population, men whose words carried weight, whose actions others would follow. His message was consistent: restraint, focus, dignity. "This isn't about revenge," he told them repeatedly. "It's about justice, about holding power accountable. We lose the moral high ground the moment we become what they already think we are, animals driven by violence." Some listened. Others, like DeShawn, heard his words but remained unconvinced. "Talk to me about moral high ground when you've had your ribs cracked by Danning's crew," DeShawn muttered as they prepared for yard time. "Some things can't be settled with paperwork and investigations." Rook studied his friend carefully. "You're planning something." It wasn't a question. DeShawn's expression remained impassive. "I'm planning to see justice done, one way or another." Before Rook could press further, the cell block doors slid open for afternoon recreation. As inmates filed into the yard, the usual segregation by race and affiliation was notably absent. Instead, men gathered in mixed groups, an unprecedented unity that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. From his position near the weight pile, Ethan Price caught Rook's eye, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Rook gave an imperceptible shake of his head, a refusal to endorse whatever Price had planned. The white supremacist's face hardened momentarily before he turned away, gesturing subtly to his lieutenants, who immediately began moving through the yard, whispering to selected men. "It's starting," Carlos murmured, appearing at Rook's side. "Price's people are spreading the word. They're going to create a distraction at the east fence, draw the guards away from the administrative entrance." Rook scanned the yard, noting the guards' positions, the unusual clustering of inmates, the subtle preparations for chaos. "How much time do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less, Carlos replied. Danning just arrived. They brought him in through the staff entrance. DeShawn, who had been silently observing their exchange, straightened to his full, imposing height. "Time to make a choice, Rook. You with us or not?" The question hung between them, laden with the weight of their years of friendship, their shared suffering, their different visions of justice. "I'm always with you," Rook replied finally. "But I need to know what 'with you' means today." Before DeShawn could answer, a shout erupted from the eastern edge of the yard. 2 inmates had begun fighting near the fence, their violence excessive and theatrical, clearly staged. As guards rushed to intervene, someone in the crowd produced a crude incendiary device, tossing it toward an equipment shed. The explosion was small but effective, sending a plume of black smoke into the air. Alarms immediately blared across the facility, and the remaining guards began herding inmates toward the exits, following standard riot protocol. Instead of complying, groups of men scattered in different directions. Some joined the growing chaos by the fence, while others used the confusion to move toward the administrative wing. Price and his crew led the charge, armed with makeshift weapons hastily produced from hiding places. "DeShawn!" Rook called, grabbing his friend's arm as he turned to join the surge. "Don't do this, not like this." DeShawn shook him off, his expression resolute. "It's too late for talk. Danning faces us today, all of us." He pointed toward the growing chaos. "You coming or not?" In that moment, Rook realized he faced a pivotal choice: remain committed to his principles of nonviolence and lose influence over what was about to unfold, or join the tide and attempt to guide it toward the least destructive outcome. "I'm coming," he decided, falling into step beside DeShawn. "But we do this my way, no killing, no matter what." DeShawn gave a curt nod, though his eyes remained hard with barely contained fury. Together, they moved against the tide of inmates, being corralled back to their cells, using the growing chaos as cover. In the administrative wing, Mark O'Shea stood guard outside the conference room where Danning sat with the state investigators, his expression growing increasingly concerned as alarms blared throughout the facility. "What's happening?" demanded the lead investigator, a stern-faced woman from the Department of Corrections. "Disturbance in the yard," O'Shea replied, listening to the chatter on his radio. "They're implementing containment protocols." Danning, who had been slouched in his chair during the questioning, straightened, a flash of his old authority returning. "It's not a random disturbance," he stated flatly. "It's coordinated, targeting me." The investigators exchanged glances. "That's speculation," the lead investigator said dismissively. "It's experience," Danning countered. 23 years in this place, I know when something's planned." He turned to O'Shea, his expression a mixture of contempt and desperation. "They're coming for me, aren't they?" Before O'Shea could respond, his radio crackled with urgent reports. Multiple security breaches, guards overwhelmed, inmates moving through restricted areas. "We need to relocate you," O'Shea decided, drawing his baton. "This area isn't secure." "Relocate where?" Danning demanded. "The whole prison's compromised." "There's an exit through the staff gymnasium," O'Shea explained, already moving toward the door. "We can get you to the parking area from there." The lead investigator rose. "We're coming too. Our investigation—" "With all due respect, ma'am, your investigation won't matter much if people die today," O'Shea cut in. "Please follow my lead and stay close." As they moved into the corridor, the distant sounds of the riot grew louder, shouting, crashing, the occasional dull thud of riot suppression weapons being deployed. O'Shea led the group away from the main administration area, taking a service corridor that he hoped would bypass the worst of the chaos. They were halfway to the gymnasium when the lights flickered, then failed completely, plunging the windowless corridor into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. "Keep moving," O'Shea ordered, his grip tightening on his baton. "We're almost there." As they rounded the final corner, O'Shea stopped abruptly. The corridor ahead was blocked by a group of inmates, Ethan Price and 5 of his crew, armed with crude but effective prison weapons. Well, well, Price drawled, his pale eyes fixed on Danning. Look who we found, boys. O'Shea raised his radio. This is Officer O'Shea. Need immediate backup, Corridor B7, armed inmates, hostage situation developing. Static was his only answer. They've jammed the frequencies, one of the investigators realized, her voice tight with fear. Smart, Price acknowledged with a cold smile. We had help from the outside. Amazing what people will do for the right price. O'Shea positioned himself between the inmates and the others, baton extended. Price, think about what you're doing. This won't end well for anyone. Might not end well for me, Price agreed. But it'll definitely end badly for him. He pointed at Danning with what appeared to be a sharpened piece of metal plumbing. We've got a score to settle. I protected you, Danning hissed, his voice cracking with disbelief. For years I gave your people privileges, looked the other way. And then you didn't. Price cut him off. You got scared, started making mistakes. Became a liability. His smile widened. In here, liabilities get eliminated. O'Shea adjusted his stance, assessing the uneven odds. You'll have to go through me first. That can be arranged, Price replied coldly. Before the situation could escalate further, new voices echoed from behind Price's group. That's enough, Price. Rook and DeShawn appeared at the far end of the corridor, flanked by their own allies. A diverse group representing various prison factions, united in common purpose. Price turned, clearly surprised by their arrival. Thought you weren't interested in our party, counselor. I'm not interested in your methods, Rook corrected, moving forward. But we do have business with Danning. The standoff had now evolved, with O'Shea and the officials caught between two opposing inmate factions. DeShawn's eyes locked on Danning, his massive frame vibrating with barely contained rage. You remember me, Sergeant? He asked, voice dangerously soft. Remember what your boys did to me in that cell? My ribs still ain't healed right. Danning's face had gone pale, his former authority completely evaporated in the face of his worst nightmare, being trapped among the very men he had tormented for years, without the protection of his badge or the system that had enabled him. This isn't justice, O'Shea argued, addressing both groups. It's revenge, and it undermines everything we've been working toward with the investigation. Investigation? DeShawn scoffed. Man, you still don't get it. The system protects its own. Always has, always will. They'll find a way to let him off easy. Not this time, the lead investigator interjected, stepping forward despite O'Shea's attempt to keep her back. We have concrete evidence. Multiple witnesses. The security logs. This case will be prosecuted to the fullest extent. Heard that before, Price said dismissively. Means nothing once the media attention dies down. The tension in the corridor was reaching a breaking point. O'Shea could see the fury in the inmates' eyes, the terror in Danning's, the uncertainty in the investigators. Whatever happened in the next few moments would define not just Danning's fate, but the moral legitimacy of everything Rook had been fighting for. You wanted justice, not vengeance, O'Shea reminded Rook quietly. This isn't it. Rook's gaze moved from O'Shea to Danning, then to DeShawn, whose hands were clenched into massive fists, ready to deliver the beating he believed Danning deserved. You're right, Rook acknowledged finally. But justice requires confrontation first. He turned to Price. No weapons, no killing. If that's not acceptable, we can settle things between us right now. Price considered, clearly weighing his options. After a tense moment, he lowered his makeshift weapon, signaling his men to do the same. Fine. But he answers for what he did. To all of us. Rook nodded, then addressed the terrified Danning directly for the first time. You spent years making us feel powerless, Sergeant. Now you're going to listen while we tell you exactly what that felt like. As the emergency lights continued to bathe the corridor in crimson, Danning found himself surrounded by the men he had brutalized, threatened, and tormented. Men who now held his fate in their hands. His authority stripped away, his allies gone, his system of protection collapsed. He faced the ultimate reckoning. accountability to those he had never considered fully human. And in that moment, Sergeant Ray Danning experienced something he had inflicted countless times but never truly understood: absolute powerlessness. The emergency lighting cast long shadows in the corridor, bathing everything in a hellish red glow that seemed fitting for the moment of judgment unfolding within its confines. Sergeant Ray Danning, once the untouchable authority figure of Midland Correctional, stood with his back against the wall, sweat beading on his forehead as he faced the men he had tormented for years. His suit, worn for the state investigators, was now rumpled and stained with sweat. A cut above his eye from Price's initial confrontation leaked blood down his face, making him look like the victim he had never allowed himself to be. "You wanted to say something to me?" He managed a final desperate attempt to maintain some illusion of control. "So, talk. Get it over with." Rook stepped forward, his calm presence forming a barrier between Danning and the more volatile inmates who surrounded them. "It's not that simple, Sergeant," he replied. "We're not here to talk, we're here for accountability." "Is that what this is?" Danning's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Looks like a lynch mob to me." DeShawn's massive fist slammed into the wall, beside Danning's head, causing the former guard to flinch violently. "You don't get to use that word," DeShawn growled. "Not after what you've done to us." O'Shea maintained his position between the inmates and the state investigators, his baton still drawn, but held loose at his side. A symbol of authority he no longer fully believed in, but couldn't entirely abandon. "Whatever happens here," he warned, addressing Rook rather than the others, "it changes everything. Cross certain lines and there's no going back." "We know," Rook acknowledged. "That's why we need to be clear about what happens next." He turned to address the assembled inmates. "Each of you has suffered under Danning's rule. Each has a right to be heard, but we will not become what he believes us to be." Price scoffed, gesturing to Danning with contempt. "You think he ever showed that kind of restraint? Man's got blood on his hands, Johnson, Torres, Williams, how many others we don't even know about?" "That's different," Danning protested weakly. "I was doing my job, maintaining order in a—" The backhand from DeShawn caught him across the mouth, silencing him mid-sentence. Blood sprayed from his split lip as he staggered against the wall. "That's enough," Rook said firmly, placing a restraining hand on DeShawn's arm. "We're not him. We don't have to be." DeShawn's eyes blazed with years of accumulated rage. "Move aside, Rook. Man's got a debt to pay and I'm collecting." "And then what?" Rook challenged. "You kill him, and what happens? Every stereotype about violent criminals is confirmed. Every abuse justified in the name of security. The system closes ranks and nothing changes." "I don't care about changing the system anymore," DeShawn replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I care about him paying for what he did to us. To me." The tension in the corridor thickened. Behind O'Shea, the state investigators watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, witnessing a raw confrontation that their official reports would never capture. "If I may," the lead investigator interjected cautiously, "what's happening now, this confrontation, is actually strengthening our case. Multiple witnesses confronting the accused, specific allegations that can be documented and investigated." Price laughed bitterly. "Lady, you still don't get it. We're past investigations, past paperwork and hearings and all that bureaucratic bullshit that protects people like him." He pointed at Danning with his makeshift weapon. "This is prison justice, the only kind that ever works in here." "He's right," Danning said suddenly, his voice finding new strength in desperation. "You want to kill me? Go ahead. Prove me right. Prove that you're exactly what I always said. Animals who need to be caged and controlled." The provocative words hung in the air, a deliberate attempt to goad his captors into violence that would validate his worldview. Rook's expression hardened as he recognized the manipulation. "That's what you want, isn't it? For us to kill you and prove your point. To die a martyr to your vision of order." Danning said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes confirmed Rook's assessment. "Not happening." Rook continued, addressing the other inmates now. "Listen to me, all of you. This man has taken enough from us, our dignity, Our humanity, years of our lives, he doesn't get to take our moral authority too. Moral authority? DeShawn repeated incredulously. Man, we're convicted felons. Society already decided we don't have any moral authority. Society was wrong, Rook countered firmly, and this is our chance to prove it. In the silence that followed, the distant sounds of the riot could still be heard. Shouts, crashes, the methodical advance of the emergency response team as they regained control of the facility sector by sector. Time was running out. Here's what's going to happen, Rook declared, his voice carrying the weight of natural leadership that had nothing to do with official power. Danning is going to face each of us one by one. He's going to hear what he did to us, look us in the eye as we tell him, and then, he paused, making sure he had everyone's attention, then he's going to walk out of here alive to face the justice system he corrupted. Protests erupted immediately. After everything he's done, man deserves worse. That's not justice. Rook raised his hand, silencing them with the authority of his presence alone. The hardest part of justice isn't punishing the guilty, it's maintaining your own principles while doing it. He looked directly at DeShawn. We can't build something better by using his methods. DeShawn stared back, the internal conflict visible in his eyes, rage warring with respect for the man who had been his moral compass for years. You're asking a lot, he said finally. After what he did to me, to all of us. I'm asking you to be better than him, Rook replied simply. I'm asking you to show him that everything he believed about us was wrong. A heavy silence fell over the corridor. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere, the bloodlust that had driven the confrontation giving way to something more complex, more difficult, but ultimately more powerful. O'Shea watched in quiet amazement as Rook accomplished what no guard or warden had ever managed, transforming mob fury into solemn purpose. One by one, the inmates stepped forward. Each faced Danning directly, recounting the specific abuses, humiliations, and injustices they had suffered at his hands. Some spoke quietly, others with barely contained rage. All forced him to look them in the eye as they reclaimed the dignity he had stripped from them. You had me put in solitary for 2 weeks because I wouldn't become your informant, said Carlos. I missed my mother's funeral. You planted drugs in my cell when I filed a complaint about water quality, another man stated, added 3 years to my sentence. You stood and watched while your guards broke my jaw, said a third, pointing to a badly healed fracture, then reported that I had fallen during an escape attempt. With each testimony, Danning seemed to physically shrink, the psychological armor of authority stripped away layer by layer. By the time DeShawn's turn came, the former sergeant was visibly trembling. DeShawn towered over him, massive hands flexing at his sides. You know what you did to me, he said, voice tight with controlled fury. You know what your boys did under your orders. I could kill you right now with my bare hands. He leaned closer until his face was inches from Danning's. But Rook's right. You're not worth becoming you for. When the ritual of testimony was complete, Danning looked utterly defeated, a hollow shell of the man who had ruled Midland with such confident cruelty. Yet even in defeat, the poison that had driven him for decades surfaced once more. You think this changes anything? He spat, blood from his split lip spraying as he spoke. This whole system was built to keep people like you contained, controlled. One guard falls, another takes his place. His gaze swept over the assembled, men with undisguised contempt. You're still prisoners, still caged animals following the strongest among you. He looked directly at Rook. And you? Playing at being some kind of prison Gandhi? They'll never see you as anything but another nigger in a jumpsuit. Your precious moral authority means nothing outside these walls. The slur landed like a physical blow, designed to provoke the violence that would validate Danning's worldview. Several inmates surged forward, but Rook's raised hand stopped them. Thank you, Sergeant, he said calmly. Danning blinked in confusion. For what? For showing everyone exactly who you are, Rook replied. The state investigators, Officer O'Shea, Every man here, they all just witnessed the real Ray Danning. The man behind the badge. The hatred that drove every decision you ever made. He smiled thinly. You've done more to prove our case than we ever could. The former sergeant's face contorted as he realized his final attempt at provocation had backfired completely. His gaze darted wildly around the corridor, finding no sympathy in any face. Not even from the officials he had expected to maintain solidarity with law enforcement. The lead investigator stepped forward, her expression resolute. I've heard enough, she announced, addressing both inmates and officers. What's happened here will be fully documented in our report. I give you my word that Sergeant Danning's actions will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Your word doesn't mean much to us, Price observed coldly. Then judge me by my actions, she replied. Starting now. She turned to O'Shea. Officer, please place Sergeant Danning in restraints. He'll be leaving with us under arrest, not as a witness. O'Shea hesitated for only a moment before producing his handcuffs. Raymond Danning, you're under arrest for the suspected murder of Marcus Johnson, abuse of authority, falsification of official records, and violation of inmates' civil rights. The formal words carried the weight of years of unacknowledged injustice finally being addressed. As O'Shea secured the cuffs around Danning's wrists, the ultimate reversal of roles, the distant sound of approaching boots signaled that the prison's emergency response team was finally reaching their location. It's time to go, O'Shea told. The inmates. The ERU won't ask questions when they arrive, they'll just see a hostage situation. Rook nodded, turning to the others. We've done what we came to do. Now we walk away, dignified, on our terms. And go back to our cells? Price questioned bitterly. After all this? For now, Rook acknowledged. But knowing that we changed something today, not just for us, but for everyone who comes through these walls after us. The sound of the approaching response team grew louder. Time to choose, Rook said simply. Justice or revenge? One by one, the inmates began to back away, melting into the adjoining corridors to make their way back to the areas where the riot was being contained. No one rushed, no one panicked. They moved with the dignity of men who had reclaimed something essential that had been taken from them. DeShawn was the last to leave, his gaze lingering on Danning with complex emotions playing across his features. This isn't over, he told the former sergeant quietly, but it's a start. When the emergency response team finally burst into the corridor in full riot gear, they found an unexpected scene. O'Shea standing with the handcuffed Danning and the state investigators, no inmates in sight. Situation resolved, O'Shea reported calmly. Sergeant Danning is being remanded to state custody on multiple charges. The team leader's confusion was evident even through his tactical mask. The inmates? Dispersed voluntarily, O'Shea replied. No further action required. As they escorted Danning out through the administrative wing, the former sergeant walked with the shuffling gait of a broken man. The handcuffs that had been his tool of control for decades now bound his own wrists, a symmetry that escaped no one who witnessed his departure. Word of what had transpired spread through Midland with impossible speed, reaching every cell and corner of the facility before Danning had even been loaded into the state vehicle. By evening lockdown, the entire prison population knew that something unprecedented had occurred, not just the fall of a corrupt guard, but a moment when inmates had held power and chosen justice over vengeance. In the relative privacy of their cell, DeShawn sat on the edge of his bunk, studying Rook with newfound respect. I still don't know if you were right, he admitted. Part of me still thinks he deserved worse. He'll face worse, Rook replied. Years in prison, but as an inmate, not a guard. A former officer with a reputation for racist abuse, no protection, no authority. He shook his head. We couldn't have designed a more fitting punishment if we tried. DeShawn considered this, then nodded slowly. Maybe, but that's not why you stopped us from killing him, is it? No, Rook acknowledged. I stopped us because the moment we took his life, we would have validated everything he believed about us. We would have given the system the excuse it needed to crack down even harder, to treat us with even less humanity. He moved to the small window of their cell, gazing out at the prison yard now emptied by the lockdown that followed the riot. What we did today was more dangerous to them than any act of violence could have been, he continued. We showed restraint, moral authority. We forced them to see us as human beings capable of justice, not just revenge. You really think it changes anything? DeShawn asked, echoing Danning's bitter question. Rook turned back to his friend, a quiet certainty in his eyes. I know it does. Not the whole system, not overnight. But something shifted today. In us, in the guards who witnessed it, in the investigators who will file their reports. Outside their cell, the familiar sounds of the evening count began. Steel doors sliding shut, officers calling numbers, the mechanical rhythm of institutional control reasserting itself. We're still here, DeShawn observed. Still prisoners. Yes, Rook agreed, but something's different now. He held DeShawn's gaze steadily. They can lock our bodies in these cells. They can control our movements, restrict our freedom. But after today, they can never again convince themselves or us that they can imprison our humanity. As night fell over Midland Correctional Facility, the system's routines continued unchanged on the surface. Guards patrolled, locks engaged, lights dimmed according to established protocols. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, a fundamental shift had occurred, a fault line running through the very foundation of power and control. For in that red-lit corridor, men who had been systematically dehumanized had made the most human choice of all, to see their tormentor not as a monster, to be destroyed, but as a man to be held accountable. They had chosen the harder path of justice over the immediate satisfaction of revenge. And in doing so, they had reclaimed something more valuable than freedom itself. They had reclaimed their dignity. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.